All right. It is that time of year, or should I say the end of year, when I invite Gray Crawford back on the program to talk about the year ahead astrology. So today we are going to be talking about all about the astrology of 2023, which yeah, it's going to be a lot. Buckle up, get a tea, get a get a coffee, whatever you need, because this is probably going to be a lengthy episode. So thanks for joining me again, Gray, to do the year ahead.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's nice. Yeah, this is the
Three.
four. We've already done three.
Three
So this is the fourth, I
or
think.
the
Fourth,
four.
fourth in a
Did
row.
we do
That
2019 or did we
Oh,
start
we
with
did
2020?
2020, 21, 2022. So this is
Oh,
2020,
2020. That
23.
is.
Yeah. So we're on a solid number four year.
That's funny. I thought it was three. This is our fourth year ahead, you know? So someone out there, tip your cup to us because this is a lengthy undertaking. But it's always fun to look at the year ahead, right? I mean, that's what us astrologers do is we want to know what's coming, the best of our abilities, of course. So we're
Yeah.
going to try to figure that out, right, Gray?
Yeah, and I was just thinking about this earlier, how that 2020 year astrology.com had asked me to write like a year ahead forecast, and they were actually asking me to write a bunch of different articles about a bunch of different kind of like year ahead things. And that's the first time I had ever written so many different things for some publication, like looking ahead. And then you asked me to come on here to do that year ahead. And that was the first time I ever went on somebody's like podcast to talk about the year ahead. And that was like, yeah, for 2020 to be the first one, that was there's so much to look at, and I was really worried about. And then subsequently, we've done this each year, and 2021 and 2022, coming out of everything happened in 2020, just extremely volatile years. And although there's definitely going to be lots of change and new things happening in 2023, I personally don't have the same feeling of looking at this. Just obviously the state of the world right now is troubling in many ways, including where this year, where as we're recording this one, we already have a major war going on. That being said, as far as just the astrology is concerned and what you can like work with the astrology, I feel a lot better about this year, about being able to like really make some progress and get some things developing out of all just like the really massive changes the last couple of years.
Yeah, amen to that. Because all those grand conjunctions and those outer planet, the Saturn Uranus square, these slow movers are no joke when it comes to crunching the astrology. So to be slowly but surely leaving that influence does seem very hopeful in many respects. And I feel like this year has a lot of signatures for just new beginnings and fresh energy coming in, and the opportunity to, I don't want to say finally start, but just kind of like, I feel like there's this turn a new leaf sort of energy that comes to this year, which I know a lot of us are ready for that, in my own life and in client work and just observations. It feels like it's time.
Yeah,
And
I was thinking
yeah.
about that too. It's more so than just saying, oh, it's a new chapter, or I mean, it's like a whole new story. Obviously, it's connected to the previous stories, but there's a definite big change happening in terms of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So to just give an overview of some of the things that are happening here. Well, maybe I should start. Gray, tell, just in case, I'm hoping people listen to the podcast for a long time, but if they haven't, just give a brief background of who's Gray. Who are you?
Yeah, so I am a practicing astrologer. My practice is mostly focused on doing natal consultations with people. I really enjoy doing that. Do some horary. I have a site, graycrawford.net, where I'm writing regularly about the transits, sometimes other stuff, usually about like new moons and full moons and transits. And I also have a Patreon that you can support me through, where I include writing, and I've started more recently putting in some elections and sort of electional ritual types of things. And also, I just very recently finally started a YouTube channel, which is a bit ridiculous to say because of how many people have YouTube channels for so long, but I never had got one going. And so, yeah, I've started doing that and putting videos on Patreon for that too. Some that are just available to that, but I'm going to start doing in the year ahead some public ones and actually get that developing for myself, which is actually a good analogy, I think, for everybody. You know, for somebody else, it's gonna be something totally different, but just stuff you've been wanting to do and just maybe it hasn't quite come through yet. There's been so much change happening in the last few years. I know back in 2019 or early in 2019, when I first was looking, not just looking ahead, but realizing I had to like make statements that people were going to be reading about the year ahead. Besides all the Saturn, Pluto, and the Aries ingress chart that year, and the Saturn, Jupiter, and all that, the thing that really struck me the most about being kind of worried was that we're going to go from all that, like Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn, Jupiter, into this really extended Saturn, Uranus time. And that was no joke. I mean, that did not go the way I thought it was going to go exactly. I mean, a lot of things happened I did not imagine would happen. But as far as how difficult that's been, that happened. And so what's great about this year, the beginning of the year, we're still seeing that play out, but then we really shift into something different happening. And so we're actually finally coming out of that into a very mysterious alchemical solutio of Saturn Neptune, which is a whole nother story that's going to be playing out in the years ahead, but it's something different. It's not the same.
Yeah, it is something different. And I will give Gray a plug here before we continue on with our 2023, that he just did a whole presentation on Saturn and Pisces and involving the Neptune conjunction that will eventually be coming. So Gray, do you have that for sale? Or you have that up on your website?
Yeah, I have a talk I did for NCGR in Philadelphia that people can purchase from my site.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I watched it. It's highly informative. You're going to want to, I'm sure, for a nominal, affordable fee, it's worth the watch or the listen. So definitely go check that out. So, all right. Are you ready for this?
Yeah, definitely.
Y'all ready for this? That's what I hear in my head. It's like the basketball game starting. All right. So 2023. Let's start with an overview of just some of the significant astrological underworkings that are happening here. Saturn in Pisces, as I just mentioned here, is absolutely a big one. We have Pluto dipping its subterranean toe into Aquarius, which is big news. We got Jupiter that's going to be moving fully through Aries and into Taurus. And on the way, we'll make a square to Pluto, which will be interesting at the 0 degrees of fixed signs. And so there's going to be this theme of 0 degrees of fixed signs coming back up. That has already been happening since the end of 2020. So we'll talk about that. We have the nodes and the eclipses that are going to move from Taurus and Scorpio into Aries and Libra, so cardinal signs. We have Mercury retrograde cycles taking place in all Earth signs, which is interesting. I definitely want to pick your brain about that, Gray. And last but not least of the bigger cycles, we have Venus, who's going to retrograde in Leo. So out of that lineup, is there one that you think is I wouldn't say most important, they're all important, but which do you think is most impactful for 2023?
I mean, I'd go with Saturn. Saturn going into Pisces, because Saturn's been in its domiciles of Capricorn and Aquarius for years now. What was that? I want to say it was the very end of 2017 that it went into Capricorn. So like 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. It's been Saturn in its own sign. And there's always a sequence where we go from, because of the way the zodiac's set up, we go from Saturn in this Jupiter sign of Sagittarius into this long stretch, years of Saturn in its own sign. And then it comes out of that into another Jupiter sign, which is Pisces. And it would be this Pisces is a sign that Saturn, just traditionally doesn't have any special like quality. And although it does rule the first 10 degrees in one of the decanic rulership schemes, but at least like in Sagittarius, it's got triplicity. Jupiter, Saturn, fire signs has a thing. Then it's in 2 of its own signs, and then it goes into Pisces, which is like this very, obviously watery, nocturnal, yin, inward sign. And what's so important this year is that Neptune is there. Neptune's just waiting for Saturn. And so as soon as that goes in, we're going to start picking up on the Saturn-Neptune. That Saturn-Neptune alignment comes in exactly in 2026 at 0 degrees of Aries, which is incredible. This is an incredible statement.
Yeah.
And in 2025, they do both go into Aries, and they both are at 0 Aries, and they get within, I think, 13 arc minutes of one another, but they don't exactly come together. But 2025, they basically are together, and they're really close together at the end of Pisces. They both go into Aries. So 2023 especially, they don't get within like 20 degrees of one another. And then 2024, I think they get up to maybe like about 10 or so degrees away from one another. So we'll pick it up a little bit more next year, but this year is going to be just sort of adjusting to that. And just going from, Saturn all about, interestingly, one of the big things we have out of this time period is, lockdown with around COVID and everything, and people being like actually locked down, confined in their homes. It's just like the most extreme manifestation of that idea. But we would normally just kind of think anyway about Saturn, like locking things down, being about boundaries, defining things. Going into Pisces, in any situation, it's going to sort of start dissolving all of that control and all of those boundaries. And the idea of the alchemical solutio, it makes me think of, but with Neptune there, it's just that's going to be amplified to such a degree. And I think positively, it's an incredibly creative aspect. And I think there will be great creative things happening in all types of fields. I think because Pisces is an inward, cold water sign. Saturn's known as being cold and dry, but it's excessively cold. So that coldness is really amped up. And so, Pisces being the 2 fish, we have a couple of sides of ourselves. I'm very Pisces. And so there can be this, Saturn coming in there can be this sort of like downward spiral of depression to be working through and lethargy at times. But that moistness of Pisces being ruled by Jupiter and Venus, Neptune also being there, it's going to start dissolving a lot of the places of control and limitation, and things are going to really start, mixing up. They talk about in ancient texts, like spiritual regeneration can't happen without water. And the sort of solutio and alchemy is sort of about the thing that's solid. For the transformation to happen, it has to dissolve back into like the prima materia, of like the watery fluid. And what's interesting is the word solution is like the solution to your problem. When you talk about a liquid solution, that is the solution, is going into that solution of things kind of dissolving. And then at the same time, Saturn there can bring about like a thickening and a coagulating, and things will start stirring and coming out of that. I'm sort of thinking about it maybe on one level, like a kind of a cauldron that you're containing things and maybe cooking something in, but that's just a huge change. And there's so much that I know we need to be more concise and not take up all the time, but Saturn, Neptune in history, just really briefly, part of that dissolving of orders that happen is there's a long history of revolutions happening and rebellions. Often they get shut down and they don't go well. But as far as the classic, in the Protestant Reformation with like Martin Luther, we have like the Peasant War. 19th century, we had these like there are now like almost like peasant revolts. We have the Russian Revolution. Last time we had the Tiananmen Square, that huge revolution that the Chinese, massacred and shut down. But in Soviet Union, there were all these revolutions, and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Berlin Wall came down. That all dissolved, and so it's often driven by economic inequities and people dealing with poverty and suffering from and build up. And something about that Neptune, I think it can create almost like this tidal wave. It can really bring people together. It connects people in with like the suffering. And what's interesting is because we've been dealing that related to the pandemic, we're likely to see a lot more stuff like that building. And we already see that in Iran with the Masa Amini protest, which actually have a lot to do with Neptune, with some charts I've looked at related to that. Her planetary nodes, her lunar nodes are lined up with the planetary nodes of Neptune, actually. And in China, people in China are actually protesting already, which is kind of unheard of since Tiananmen Square. So you can already see stuff kind of kicking up with that.
Well, it's interesting because that is a big part of it, right? The Saturn focuses on, the authority structures, but also the limitations within things. And Pisces brings up, like what you're kind of saying, connected with people that may be in a lesser position or poverty or general welfare in some way. And when I just went back and looked at Saturn in Pisces just in the 20th century alone, there was a pretty clear theme of what was going on, at least government speaking, as far as like the agenda. And this is all the time of like from 33 to 37 when they put in the Social Security Act. The Alcoholics Anonymous was founded. If that's not Saturn in Pisces, I don't know what is.
That's a good one.
There was the United States versus Butler court case that gave Congress the right to tax and people to spend on general welfare. And in the 60s, from 64 to 65, that's when Medicaid and Medicare came out, and the Great Society that LBJ was trying to create. And what I found really interesting with this particular time was actually the Higher Education Act that came out that basically was part of the Great Society plan, that it was to give opportunities like scholarships and federal aid to people who wanted to go to take part in higher education, saying that it wasn't a luxury, it was actually a necessity, if that's not Saturn. And so I find it really interesting that we're here going into this whole student loan forgiveness thing that's going on in Congress right now, but it's being blocked by people, Republicans in certain states that, feel they're entitled to the revenue from that. And so, it's interesting to see where that will go. I have kind of good feelings about it, just seeing, kind of Saturn and Pisces track record there.
Civil rights stuff too.
Civil rights stuff, ending legalized racial segregations with the Civil Rights Act.
And
the Immigration Act to remove discrimination from non-Western immigrants. Like it's very telling, kind of the Saturn and Pisces story, it feels.
It's like was it 64 to 60? It's a really creative part of the 60s. I know one thing I noticed just with like the most famous rock band from the period, the Beatles, it goes from like the Beatles as like Hard Day's Night Beatles, and when Saturn's leaving Pisces, they're recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So it's like that whole evolution of the Beatles across that period, which you just saw like which is represent. We could do a whole thing just about
I
music
know
of
I was
Saturn and
looking at that.
Saturn and Pisces, but that happens
Yeah.
again in the mid '90s. We had the the trio of Nirvana had come in, sort of like the Beatles, right before during Saturn and Aquarius, and yeah, there's a lot happening, and hip hop was a lot going on there too in the mid '90s, but very creative time. With the civil rights, though, yeah, I know in the '60s around that, one thing I thought was interesting was Mandela had been organizing a lot of stuff, and then he was imprisoned. But then, when during the Saturn Neptune time, something else that was starting to finally end, then which he'd been fighting against apartheid, and by the time we got to Saturn and Pisces, you know, he was becoming an elected leader. He was like out of prison. Yeah. He got released, I think, around a little bit after the Saturn Neptune, and then when he goes into Pisces, he's actually like elected, and they're changing like the flag. In the '60s, there was stuff like the Black Panthers formed during Saturn and Pisces. It's when like Malcolm X was murdered. Selma, Martin Luther King doing Selma was Saturn and Pisces. So just lots of stuff. Yeah, that was another thing, is that was also Pluto, Uranus, and Virgo opposite Saturn and Pisces. And then the '90s was also, you can't separate that. It was Neptune, Uranus, and Capricorn ruled by Saturn and Pisces, which is, you know, those last two Saturn and Pisces periods had these really major outer alignments at the same time.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's one thing we do have to talk about when Saturn and Pisces is Jupiter's moves, because obviously now that it's in Pisces, Jupiter is going to be playing a big role there. But I find it interesting with just thinking about this in my head, because that's where my thoughts happen. That one of the things that was created in the '60s too was the Department of Urban Development, which is HUD. For, you know, working on housing for homeless, for lower income, and just regulating housing. And so I find it interesting because, like, it's, you know, Saturn in Pisces, it's almost like form is coming to this place that actually can be a little sloppy to some extent, but it can also give form to what has gotten sloppy, because I mean, Saturn in Capricorn and Aquarius just back to back. It's like Saturn just does its thing. And it's not taking any, you know, other things into consideration. And one of the big things that's going on in my city, and I see it happening elsewhere, obviously, like the housing situation, but people are just building here like left and right this whole time. And no one is stopping this consistent development. But the plans aren't like fully thought out for like who needs the housing, any type of parking situation. Like they want to build a 100-unit building down the street from me with no parking. And there's no parking in the neighborhood already. And so where do they expect, you know, like it's just all these regulations that people are just pushing forward to make the money and to line the pockets of the politicians and the developers and all that. And HUD was actually, that was one of the things that was part of that, that being established, is to help regulate these things for the good of the greater society, because you can't just like, anyways, I'm going on a tangent, but
no, it's not. I mean, and that's what's going on. And homelessness is massive. There's lots of, you know, quote unquote conspiracy theories all over the place. And the one thing though that, like, I think instead of everyone getting caught up arguing with each other, I just would like everyone to focus on personally, it's just that whether or not these were related to some of the theories people have out there, it was basically this massive transfer of wealth. What did happen with the pandemic and how that played out? It was like a massive transfer of wealth. And the people that were already wealthy and had disproportionate control of things became massively more wealthy, and the people that were struggling went in the other direction. And there's massive homeless, problems all over the place. And then it's hard to get housing because people are just buying up units, everywhere.
Well, yeah, developers are coming in and no one's stopping that. And it's like, well, if no one stops that at some time, there's never going to be an opportunity for an individual to purchase because there's no regulation. And so I'm hoping that will be part of Saturn and Pisces too. Let me just give a little prayer out there as someone who wants to own a house someday.
I think, and that's, I mean, I don't, that whole thing is a big mess, but I mean, I think what you're speaking to there with the potential, you know, it can go obviously in different ways, because Pisces can be, Jupiter and Venus can be used in all kinds of different ways. But yeah, it's a much more it's Jupiter and Venus. It's a water sign. There is, with Neptune there too, there is this recognition, I think, more sort of like the borders of Saturn are getting kind of melted down, dissolved, and there's typically, more awareness of the people and the struggle. The last time we had Saturn and Neptune both in Pisces, it was after the conjunction, because they came together in, I believe, 1846 in Aquarius. But then in 1848, when Marx, who has Saturn in Pisces, published the Communist Manifesto, Saturn was like kind of mid Pisces and Neptune was at the beginning of Pisces. And that actually is a good example, because Saturn, Neptune, one of the things we can have with it, and which we'll see playing out, just like people can remember what happened with Saturn, Pluto, and people are kind of on, these things are coming together and they're mixing, and people are kind of being on one side or the other, kind of looking at Saturn, looking at Neptune, and Neptune looking at Saturn. And whereas Marxism was really addressing capitalism and all the issues of capitalism, which honestly are still going on, there is also this very overly materialist, which was partially because of the excess of religion and everything, and that power structure. But, you know, that was a philosophy that addressing capitalism also creating these working class groups and the struggle around that. It was also sort of taking out spirituality from that. And so you can see that in a lot of things. So with Neptune being there too, we're going to see this where, I mean, this is a huge discussion. I'm just realizing
I'm about to curb you. I'm about to curb you, Gray.
You should curb me here. But just basically the synopsis is just that on one hand, there can be skepticism in all sorts of directions. So some people being skeptical about religion and spiritual things, spiritual people being more skeptical about an overly materialistic perspective that sees the universe as meaningless, and, you know, this overly disenchanted cosmos scientific perspective. You know, they're going to be going back and forth, and there's going to be a need to find like that middle way. But definitely I would hope that there could be more people coming together locally and doing things around housing and that kind of stuff you're talking about. Yeah.
Because, I mean, we all just want to be happy, connected, fulfilled. It's a very Piscean things. And, you know, like Saturn is that outer reality. And Saturn, you know, has this strong presence in our outer world, but we deal with its implications mostly on the internal, right? You know, because that's how we respond to things. So I think that's going to be a big part of Saturn and Pisces too, is just really getting in touch, like you said, with, connecting in with that spirituality and the abundance of it or the lack thereof, questions of fulfillment, and just our internalized response to what that looks like. And if our outer, you know, the outer constructs of our reality match up to that, you know, because it is that kind of transitional space of just form in general. And so I think Jupiter coming into the picture with, you know, because Jupiter is going to be moving through, Jupiter will be in Aries when Saturn moves into Pisces, and really Jupiter will move through Aries, Taurus, and Gemini during the Saturn and Pisces transit. But as far as
and Cancer, it'll
get all the way into Cancer
by the end of it, yeah.
And so in 2023, we're only going to see the Aries Taurus component of it all. But that's something to think about, you know, the Jupiter and its forward momentum of just growth and expansion is at the very beginning of the zodiac. You know, we are talking about like this primal, like Martian fire, and the form and the fixed form of Taurus and that kind of Venusian and Earth energy. And so how do you think that that kind of back to back of Jupiter plays into, I mean, just Jupiter being there, but also its role in Saturn and Pisces.
Yeah, well, Jupiter as the ruler. One thing, Jupiter in Aries, you might say it's an aversion to Pisces, but they are signs that are equal ascension speeds, which is, and they're also contra to one another also. And so in the classic doctrine, that aversion is actually mitigated. And then it's going to move into Taurus, which is an actual sextile. And really importantly,
yes,
it forms the waxing sextile of that Jupiter Saturn conjunction, which I think is a really big deal. And I almost feel like that sextile between Jupiter and Taurus, which will also be right, Jupiter and Taurus with the north node of the moon, also right there, and Uranus and Taurus. So just like the Saturn Neptune thing starts picking up, the Jupiter Uranus thing will start picking up. That happens in 2024, but they'll be in the same sign. And that just honestly even more amplifies what everything else already saying about Saturn and Neptune coming together, because it's going to be ruled by Jupiter in the same sign as Uranus, which is when Jupiter and Uranus come together, it's extremely innovative. Lots of breakthroughs happen, lots of inventions happen, collective movements happen, counterculture things happen. So, and you're throwing the north node of the moon in there too with it. So, I'm sure we'll talk about this as we get into the forecast, but yeah, the Aries part is pretty quick because it's over by May. It goes into Taurus, but it's lined up really well with the beginning part of the year, as we'll talk about. There's a good part there where it's a lot of like really kind of being able to develop things and make there's some really great kind of forward energy movement coming in at the beginning of the year. And Jupiter in Aries is there sort of kind of like, like you're saying, like leading a charge.
It's very it's ready to plant the flag on whatever.
And it goes into Taurus, which is going to kind of slow stuff down and build, but it's going to really, I think it's going to make, just like Saturn, Neptune is going to be bringing stuff into form, maybe that you picked up with the Jupiter Neptune, but didn't actually come into form because it's very formless.
Yeah.
Jupiter Neptune things, and that should start coming together. Same thing with Uranus, all this shattering breakdown with Uranus, Jupiter coming in there. I think a lot of stuff is going to start coming together in the next couple of years. That's been kind of building.
Yeah, I totally 100% agree with that. It just seems like, intuitively that seems right.
That's partially why I feel a lot better about this year.
Well,
and for those ways,
it's kind of exciting, like I feel like there's a lot to look forward to this year. Not that there's things to look forward to in life every day, but there is something about this year that really has just this kind of bursting quality, or this building quality, or the seed is finally like, I'm viable. Let's do something with me. So that's exciting. And I think it'll be just this rush of, because what Jupiter gave us a taste during the middle of 2022 as it went through Aries, but a taste just wasn't enough. It just made us realize, like, oh, we're ready for this new thing, or just gave you enough to tell you where things might be going, or to have you realize you're like, you know what, I want to blow up my life. I don't like it the way it is. Because a lot of people are like that too, where they're just over what their life has been, or certain situations or relationships or what have you change, and then we're bringing in new scenarios. And so once again, 2022 had that kind of twisting and turning, and the final of the Saturn Uranus, but that full Aries movement of Jupiter straightforward to mid-May feels really just like, I'm ready, let's do this. I want it done yesterday, like, let's go. Of course, once Mars gets out of retrograde and out of Gemini, but that's a whole thing in itself. Now, obviously another huge thing to talk about here is Pluto moving.
We haven't talked about that yet.
Crossing the threshold into, and that's the funny thing, funny that it just goes in and sits at 0 degrees of Aquarius, right? And we get the taste of Pluto in Aquarius. Granted, once again, much like our Saturn passage, just going to another Saturn sign. So we got another 20 years of another Saturn sign.
Yeah.
But it is really, you got to give it up for celestial timing when you think about just Pluto giving us a taste of Aquarius at 0 degrees, where the Jupiter Saturn conjunction was. That's a loaded degree in the zodiac. And so here it is being activated by a loaded planet. And so, I mean, what's your first kind of inclinations about, Pluto moving into Aquarius? And I mean, as a whole, maybe, but I mean, that's a topic in itself, but
Well,
also just the taste of 2023.
Yeah. Well, you made the point already. That's one thing that's really big, is just that 0 degrees of Aquarius has become such a big symbol of the times, or degree of the times, because of the Jupiter Saturn conjunction coming there, which situates us within this 20-year Jupiter Saturn cycle. That's really big. That, again, we're just getting to like the waxing crescent sextile of this year. But yeah, if people remember back in 2020, actually, when Saturn went into Aquarius for a few months, I think it's similar. It's going to be, well, it's different than that, but similar in the way that, and also actually in 2021, when Jupiter went into Pisces for a few degrees for a few months, it's like, it's one of the things where you get the new story comes up and all these new developments start happening. And then it's going to go back to, and actually in the years ahead, it's going to go back and forth between Aquarius and Capricorn for a bit.
Yeah. A couple of years.
Yeah. Is it not until
trying
to remember when it is that I don't have that in my notes right in front of me. I have the actual date of that, but
that Pluto moves into Aquarius
to stay. Yeah, but it's like
forever.
Is it 2025 maybe?
It's November 19th, 2024.
2024. Okay, the end of 2024. It goes in for good. Okay. Yeah. So between, and it's there's a couple times where it's going to go in and out, basically between then and now. So, but yeah, it's going to, I already feel like, actually, it's been funny just looking at this recently. I feel like there's already news stories and events coming up that are already like showing it. One of which I thought was interesting with the whole age of air was they just announced this thing about this fusion reactor that the US is developing, that could, it's not ready yet, but that would be something that would be a total game changer. That's changing a lot with energy use.
Clean energy.
Yeah.
Energy
and
production.
Really. Yes. And then I saw another thing today, someone writing about these quantum computers that's not new. They've been working on this for a while, but just I saw an article just talking about the developments that are going on with these quantum computers that sort of operate on these like quantum entanglement theories, which I think is going to be something we're going to keep seeing more of, because I think that's very Pluto and Aquarius. It's very Saturn, Neptune, and Aries. Actually, I think where we're ultimately heading, because where we're ultimately heading with all of this, once Pluto settles in to Aquarius, is we get Pluto. Once we get to 2025, 2026, we get Pluto and Aquarius trining Uranus and Neptune. Pluto and Aquarius trining Uranus and Gemini. They're both sextile Saturn and Neptune. And Pluto and Aquarius trining Uranus and Gemini. They're both sextile Neptune and Aries, with Saturn having moved through there. And then eventually Jupiter goes into Leo and sets that off even more. But so, and that fusion generator, the idea, what I understand of it is it's basically trying to recreate the power of the sun in a way, which I was just thinking that's so like exaltation of Aries is the sun, right? And I don't know. That would be interesting for.
Yeah, well, and this whole idea is that it generates more power than it's putting out. So it's giving us back more than we're putting in. And it makes a lot of sense too, because I went back and, to the beginning of the common era, just looking at Pluto and Aquarius and its moves. And we talk about Pluto being power dynamics, right? A lot of times we think about power dynamics with control with one another and like power, but it can be literal power because in the like 60 AD through the 85 AD period, that's when steam power was pioneered. And then in the 1286 through 1308 period, that's when windmills were invented, So we're looking at, which is interesting when we're just thinking about air, right? Aquarius, windmills, hot and wet, steam, these types of things. So it doesn't surprise me that, especially when we're at a point of power crisis, as a society, there's these new inventions that are coming out, right? Because that's the thing too, is like we think about Uranus being this point of invention, but Aquarius is very gifted in that area as well. So that's promising in many regards, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why people started thinking of Uranus partially as ruling Aquarius for a time. Yeah, and there's definitely revolutions that go with it, and
yes,
sort of like this. There's a classic, the whole decentering idea, the sun being cohering and centering with Leo. And I think the most classic, the cycle you mentioned, like the 1286 to 1308. So that was one of the Pluto and Aquarius, and the next time was 1532 to 1553. If people are interested, and that involved the Copernicus revolution, where we went from actually thinking everything revolves around us to realizing that, we're just part of the first step to realizing. I mean, now people talk about multiverses, right, and everything, but the first step to realizing we're actually part of the solar system. And then the next time, 1777 to 1798, Pluto was in Aquarius. We had the U.S. Revolutionary War was happening and ended. We get the U.S. Constitution during that time. The French Revolution is completely encompassed by that, and that's probably one of the events people most associate with Pluto and Aquarius. But when you're talking about power, that sort of decentering, it can often be a time of people sort of claiming and taking their power back. And as far as revolutions, which again just sort of amps up some of that stuff. When we were thinking about that coming in at the same time, Saturn, Neptune is kicking up at the same time that Jupiter, Uranus is kicking up and starting to happen. We could expect some more unrest and movements starting to build during this year.
Yeah, and it really makes me think about, because I kind of went down a wormhole last night about the Great Schism. Are you familiar with the Great Schism?
Is that Henry VIII that you're talking about? Or
no,
is that a different one?
This was the break of Christianity between the East and the West, which happened during a Pluto and Aquarius period.
Oh, okay.
It happened in 1054. And granted, the big event happened in 1054, but it's hundreds of years leading up, hundreds of years after. But it is, who has the power? What's the ideologies, and the big part of the schism between like the Greek Orthodox Christian religion and the Roman Catholics actually it had to do with miscommunication, which I thought was interesting in relation to an air sign, because a lot of times the teachings and the iconography were getting mistranslated, and the other side would not like approve with it because there was like clash of language involved, where it was like a very airy thing where it just created this. I mean, there's much more to it, but when we think about power dynamics, I mean, at that time, like religion is the power. It was connected to the king. I mean, that goes on and on. I mean, we talk about the Henry VIII period. That was another Pluto and Aquarius period. And, he was excommunicated by the church because he wanted to divorce, and he went off and created his own, Church of England and so forth. And so it's interesting to think about just like the power dynamics within just the structures of just the people in power, what they're communicating, their message, and the constructs of society, not in a physical way like Capricorn, when we're building things and these are the laws and the rules or the boundaries around things. Aquarius is this group ideology or this that we attach to, and collective thinking. And yeah, so this is going to be a very complicated, interesting transit. Luckily, we have 20 years to get situated into it. But like you said, I think we're going to have some really big precursor kind of energy coming in 2023, especially as it sits at that Jupiter-Saturn point.
Yeah, definitely. The Henry VIII one is interesting too, because that's like about 8 years after, well, not 8 years, Pluto went in Aquarius 8. So earlier, that was like later in the Reformation, but the last time there was a Saturn Neptune, it was actually Saturn, Jupiter, and Neptune, and a North Node all together in Pisces is around like 1523 and 1524, and that led into like the peasant wars and revolt that was part of the Martin Luther, the beginning of the beginning of the Reformation. And what's interesting about that, it doesn't completely line up with our cycles now, but if you go back to 1517, when Luther originally like nailed up the 95 Theses, which are basically about what you're just referring to. At that point, it's different now, but you can transfer, who's in power and control now. Then it was, very much like the church had so much power and they were wanting all this money to absolve people of their sins. And he just saw it as being very corrupt. And when he nails the 95 Theses, Pluto was in Capricorn, Saturn was at the end of Sagittarius, and then we get this Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, which does actually replicate what we just went through, and that's it's all starting to go then, right? And then when we get to, and I think Neptune was in Aquarius then, but then once we get to the point where Saturn finally gets into Pisces, it just happened to line up with Neptune being there. Jupiter comes in too. And at that point, he had been previously excommunicated and battled back from that. And then it just led into these big revolutions where, and he was even, he was calling the Pope a devil, a very Saturn Neptune, but then he was also calling all the peasants revolting, like he was attacking them too, because then it got too out of control. But in any case, when these things get released, it can get kind of things can get out of control. Like the French Revolution is a classic example of that too.
Yeah. When the guillotine was invented for such reasons.
Yeah. Right. So we can expect there's maybe some new, I think with the whole full on Pluto and Aquarius will take a few years, but we can see it's already starting to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And just like a article that I read today, just like a brief thing, just thinking about it too, is like, we just spent the last 15 years or so, like in this social media world, and this, we're getting closer and closer to, our just everyday reality with being online and in this tech world. And there's been a lot of disillusion recently with the like social media and stuff. A lot of people think like Instagram is dying. We all know what's happening with Twitter and Elon Musk and stuff. And TikTok is for some people and not for other people. And so it'll be interesting to see how Pluto starts to affect that kind of big tech and that just the power that it has, and where people start to gravitate within that. As we find our space online. And that changes.
There's a thread with that to Saturn Pisces too, because the last time we had Saturn in Pisces was after, the internet really got going with Saturn in Aquarius, and then Saturn in Pisces was a lot of like people figuring out these like business deals, and like Amazon's formed so Amazon's going to have its Saturn Pisces for its first Saturn return in the years ahead. And that led into that whole, internet boom that happens that then kind of pops after Saturn gets out of Pisces. But the whole mid 90s period with that all starting to take off and take form. So, now we have this monstrosity in a way of all this stuff, but it's obviously where things are going, and we're going to be working with it. And that's going to be part of Pluto and Aquarius, is dealing with that. And there's obviously a lot of I know fears people have about it, and what that could mean. And so that'll be interesting, because it's very Pluto, because on the one hand, we have a lot of power in our hands, but then also, like, how are we being potentially, there's lots of fears about how we can be controlled by that, and the potential for like totalitarian states to, be created implementing these things, and like what ways it's going to go. It's a Pluto thing. It's Pluto and an air sign. And I think one thing too to be careful around all this too is with Saturn Neptune coming in, is just propaganda and having to wade through that. I mean, there's a thing where Aquarius can very much, Joy Usher in her book Tiny Universe, I really like, she talks about Aquarius involving brainwashing, which I think is a great way to think about Saturn, Saturn air sign. And we already see that going on, right? There's so much, when you see a story now, you have to figure out, like, where is his coming from? And, can I even believe this or not? It's like, so we're going to have to just really be keeping on using critical thinking and that kind of thing, and figuring things out with this too. Yeah,
absolutely. So get ready. Pluto in Aquarius moves in on March 23rd, and it will go retrograde on May 1st. So we only get like a little taste of the forward direct Pluto in this sign. And of course, it will retrograde back into Capricorn.
But it's such a big cycle, and it's that it's going to be eventful. Yeah.
Oh, it'll definitely be eventful.
Think about all that AI stuff. Like, everybody's creating AI portraits of themselves all of a sudden. I mean,
guilty.
But it's also very Aquarius, because it's like, oh, they're doing, I'm going to do. It's like, it's
exactly
like to this
conformity
group. Yeah, and that's what we have to watch. That's another thing we're going to have to watch for. How do you just like start conforming to a group? And with Aquarius, sometimes you got to be the heretic that takes a stand. I mean, that was hopefully a whatever data mining happening with that AI portrait was very harmless, I'm hoping.
I hope so too. I know they just basically got millions of faces now into the data bank.
In other scenarios, it can be a little more problematic, like conforming to group norms. So like at times we're going to have to be like the Aquarian, heretic, kind of like being like, well, I'm not going to go along with this because this isn't right for whatever reason, So yeah.
And that's so all right, now we only have actually we're a little over time with our overview here, Gray. So let us
we can just go and start talking about stuff.
So the only other overview is thinking about how we're going to have Mercury retrograde cycles in Earth. Venus retrograde in Leo. We can kind of talk about that when we get to that. Eclipses moving into Aries and Libra. I mean, we kind of know what that will look like, but that will coincide with the Jupiter energy, and we can talk about that.
We can talk about that one as we go. And the Mercury retrograde in Earth cycles is, we had a little bit of it last year because we were in an air year, and then in 2021 and 2022 is like air year moving to Earth. Now we get total Earth. What I think is interesting is Earth signs being more pragmatic and practical, and helping you kind of adjust to stuff on a more material level, and your kind of daily habits and routines, and maybe changing that up, is that they're all interacting with Uranus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Capricorn's trining it. The Taurus one, it stations like just before it, but close enough. And then the Virgo one, it's like trining it basically. So and Jupiter's going to be in an Earth sign later in the year. So they should be not just like real when we're saying, yes, practical and grounded and pragmatic, but actually very innovative changes, because Uranus will be involved in all of it.
It has this real Earth magician quality to it. It's like,
that. Yeah.
like it's not just concept or or feeling, it's form. It's like, how are we magically rearranging or solidifying or creating form, because it's the mind is such a powerful tool, right? And that is Mercury's strength. So having it configured to Uranus is exciting. Which now it occurred to me as Gray and I are speaking, Mercury's actually about to trine Uranus later this weekend as we record. So we're already kind of feeling it there.
We're already feeling it. Yeah.
Yeah, we're already feeling it. It's involved in that first retrograde, we're just going to talk about. So
just really quickly, Venus, just while you're on that, we'll talk about it later, but the one thing about the Venus retrograde is that it's also configured to Uranus too, as well as Jupiter and Taurus. So that'll probably, as we'll talk about, that's also going to be innovative, but also probably a lot of unrest. That's one where I'm kind of wondering if that part of the year stuff really going on with everything we've already been talking about, a lot of more unrest happening and stuff breaking out and that kind of thing.
You're like, all right, well, so let's see. Let me get our chart up here. If you're watching the video, if you're just listening, bear with us. All right, so here we are sitting at the solstice, December 21st. That's 2023. I'm a year ahead. We already made it to the end, Gray. We're done. All right. 2022. All right. So how we're going to do this year is I'm going to kind of read off just a quick overview of what's happening for each season. And then we're kind of just going to pick out the most dynamic parts and kind of roll around some thoughts with that. So obviously Capricorn season starts December 21st of 2022. So it's a little bit before 2023, but it is what kicks us off into the new year. And so one of the big things about ending this year is actually we have that, Jupiter moving back into Aries the day before the solstice, and then the sun squaring it, and then a new moon cycle that is attached to sun and Jupiter square on cardinal points. We have Mercury going retrograde in Capricorn on the 29th, right? Right before the new year there. We have a very Uranian Cancer full moon. The sun conjuncting Pluto. Venus and Aquarius activating Mars and Uranus with Mars stationing during Capricorn season. So there's a lot going on here. Anything else, Gray, in our summary before we break it down?
No, that sounds good as far as just an overall summary. I mean, I really love the solstice. I'm not, and by saying I'm not commenting on this exact solstice mundane chart and the political ramifications of that. Just that I love that it's the dark time of the year. Venus, depending on where you are, I mean, I feel like everyone should be able to start really seeing Venus. I mean, you already could see Venus potentially, but she should really be visible here. Everything you can see, I even have that chart set up. You can see the sun setting, and you can see everything it's actually even a dark moon, which just makes it even more dark. And everything is up in the sky. Everything's visible, and with Jupiter also on the world axis at Aries point, along with the sun, and it's in this chart even it's up at the middle of the sky in a way, not exactly in the midheaven, but still up there. It looks a lot to me just like that sort of going into the darkness. This time of year, we like to think about looking back on the past year and how we've grown and looking forward to the year ahead. There is, like you mentioned, a Mercury retrograde that's going to come in soon after this, which will mean we want to be still needing to make some adjustments and leaving some things behind from the past. But I think it's just a really beautiful time for the classic looking ahead the year ahead and really dreaming the year ahead. And, Jupiter being at 0 Aries, really bringing in a chance to have hope and not hope in a cynical way, like actually believing in you can actually make things happen this year, and following through on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, starting the year under a new moon cycle that has the sun square Jupiter on cardinal points, that's pretty potent. I think
Yeah.
that is an activating energy with both inspiration and tangible realities, right? Like
Hmm.
it's there's big energy there. And then to add that Mercury retrograde on the 29th, in configuration with Venus, as she's visible now and sitting kind of close to Pluto there. It feels like, I mean, whenever we have big inspirations in our life and we want to trek towards new destinations or uncharted territories, if we are any bit responsible, the Capricorn energy wants us to be, we might have to go over some things, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the beauty of this Mercury retrograde, especially in a cardinal Earth sign, is it's like if you're at a point of starting or want to start, there's probably a lot of things you got to figure out, especially in the Capricorn area of your chart. And I feel like that Mercury going retrograde is very helpful to just kind of go over that, especially when we are getting into the end of Mars being retrograde, and it's going to station
Hmm.
on January 12th, not too long after that full moon. So it's interesting that those retrogrades are kind of switching off, right? Mercury goes retrograde, ruling Mars, right as Mars is ready to leave its own cycle. But it feels preparatory.
Yeah, and there's something interesting here too, where the year begins with this Mercury retrograde, and the year's going to actually end with a Mercury retrograde. So that to me kind of plays up a bit about this year, that sort of internality and being internal, in that good kind of Capricorn way of taking everything into account is going to be really important. And last year we actually had this similar lineup of Mercury, Pluto, Venus around the turning of the year. But what's interesting is this time it's Mercury's retrograde and Venus is, instead of her being retrograde, she's becoming visible. And so it does sort of return us to like literally returns us with those transits to last year and what ended up happening, what didn't happen, what went differently. But I also agree that Mercury being retrograde, you can actually be still generating forward vision. And it's a good time, though, to be thinking about, what to also release from the past. And before we get to that Mars stationing, that full moon, and I think it's a full moon in Cancer.
Yeah.
That's lined up really closely with the reanimation of Mercury. So
Yes.
the midpoint of that Mercury cycle is going to be sort of illuminated by the full moon, which should be, I find that to be, I like that. I think
I
that'd be
love
really
this.
helpful. Yeah.
I love this, especially in configuration to Uranus. There's just talk about that
Yeah.
inventive Earth magic flow. And right before Mars is going to station, right?
Right.
It's like Mercury is going to seed in the heart of the sun as the moon like reflects back this very innovative energy, this very intuitive energy, right? The moon is in its own sign there. So it's nice and strong. And it really sets the stage for Mars, emerging from the retrograde cycle just literally a week later. So this feels really good. I mean, obviously, this is going to bring up, if you're thinking about things having to do with your house or moving or family versus, the outer world and career and your goals and all that, that's always kind of a highlight of full moons that involve Cancer and Capricorn. But just because Mercury's sitting there in that reanimation spot, Mars is about to emerge, it feels even more just kind of potent for life shifting, sudden life
Yeah.
shifts.
Yeah. And really like it plays up that like really this turning of the year and really being able to seed like the whole year ahead and what you really want to develop this year, and that it can be very innovative actually with that Uranus action. And then like you were saying, I think it's a week later or less than a week later that Mars stations direct. So this is a period of the year where I'm probably most not sure what's going to happen collectively, because we're already there's already a war happening. And so collectively with current events, I feel like this section of January could get pretty hectic, and it's hard to know what will happen, because we're going to have basically Mars stations direct then, right? January 12th. And then was it like about a week later, Mercury stations direct. And then like less than a week later, Uranus stations direct. So there's this like Mars goes direct, Mercury goes direct
to the 18th to the 22nd. It's
to the 22nd. Yeah.
It's all direct.
And in that time, Venus goes into Aquarius, and she goes through activating that Saturn Uranus again, because she's ruling the Uranus, of course. And so that can actually the Venus in Aquarius with Uranus and Taurus can be actually one of those really innovative catalytic. I mean, it's a square, but it's received. And I think personally, this can be really great and innovative for growth. But again, just because that the Saturn Uranus is going to get activated again, there might be, some of those wild current events happening that create things we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. But so that's one thing to be kind of aware of, that this is one of those more like volatile collective time periods.
Yeah.
But once we get into that Aquarius time, and Uranus goes direct, we have, I think, until like April 21st or something, when Mercury eventually goes retrograde. All the planets will be moving direct for like all of February, all of March, most of April.
Yeah.
And so there's this big push forward that you can do then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I totally agree with you on the unknown of the larger collective at this time, because especially with Jupiter sitting at the beginning of Aries, and Mars emerging as the ruler of that Jupiter, right? Like I think Jupiter has an agenda that we might not see until Mars emerges. Because so there's variable there for sure. But overall, it feels like a good start. I mean, we are in collective sign territory just in general at this time of year, right? When we go through that Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, it's just, we are in planetary territory that is more aligned with everyone. So there tends to be a little more action there.
Yeah, and I guess whatever's been going on for you with the Mars retrograde, just kind of realize this mid-January period, there might still be some frustrations as far as like, because Mars isn't going to be moving.
Yes.
But just sort of, you got to kind of stay with the process. And I think these first few weeks of January there are just great for like starting to get plans going. Again, you might have to just leave space to know that depending on what happens with things, you might have to make some adjustments, but I think it's a great period just to be really planning and think about what you want to do, and really follow your creative impulses and things like that. Because Mars stationing can also be very dynamic. You just have to maybe watch the trying to keep things cool as much as possible when you don't need to be fired up. And when you have outlets for being fired up and taking action, like do it, like find ways to direct that energy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Mercury retrograding and in an Earth sign will help cool it a little bit. And I do like how Venus is going to trine Mars right before Mars stations too. So when you're talking about the creative impulse, and connecting with that in very airy, concept oriented way, communicative way. That feels like a nice entry.
And they are in signs like, Mars, Mercury's retrograde and Mars's exaltation, and Mars is retrograde and Mercury's sign. So it's pretty dynamic in that way.
Yeah. Oh, you're gonna say, Gray?
I was just gonna say, once we get to like, was it January 18th? Just as we're adjusting to that Mars I think that Mars station will just be a little bit more intense because, you know, we're dealing with the Mars stationing, and then I think it's January 18th that Mercury stations direct. So it's like we're just starting to, it's like a double up thing, you know. And then Uranus is also going to be stationing. So that's a period where just being really mindful, and there could be some definite frustrating things to work through.
But
then,
also emerging things.
Exactly.
Because, because once we get to Aquarius season, which is next, and we already talked about Uranus stationing direct only a couple days into Aquarius season. I mean, that's kind of the kickoff there. You know, we're in fixed air territory. We have the sun squaring Uranus, kind of doing that bridge gap where the sun squares Uranus and then conjuncts Saturn during that time. We have Venus, who then makes a square with Mars, which is always dynamic in their interplay cycle. And Venus is sextiling Uranus. We have a new moon that's sextile Jupiter. So that's second new moon in a row, an aspect to Jupiter. So we're kind of carrying the Jupiter theme over in Aquarius. And Gray, you had a couple of things to say about Aquarius season as well.
Yeah, as far as what we haven't said.
Oh, we got the full moon in Leo squaring Uranus too. There seems to be a lot of Uranian energy coming up in Aquarius season here.
Yeah. Do you want to put the well, actually, you want to just throw the new moon, people watching, throw the new moon chart. We could just show this, the new moon and then the full moon, because you can see that new moon at the very beginning of Aquarius. It's an interesting thing where like the Capricorn new moon's beginning of Capricorn, the Aquarius new moon's the beginning of Aquarius, and then a Pisces new moon's going to be at the beginning of Pisces.
And then Aries, because we're going to get, spoiler alert, we get two Aries new moons, one's an eclipse.
Yeah. So, but you can see that, the sextile with Jupiter is nice here as far as coming out of this period where like Uranus is basically stationing right here.
Yeah. You can't see it, but it is. It's ready.
This just goes what we were already just talking about, this being like a volatile time, but a lot being able to emerge out of this, and then everything's moving direct. And then when you get to that full moon, you can see that it's forming a square to Uranus. So again, this is just and Saturn's still in Aquarius at this point. So that full moon then, pings them both. So I really kind of see this as like one of the final, maybe this is the final ultimate activation of Saturn Uranus. I don't know if whatever's going to happen in this time period, they're probably not going, quietly into the night. There's probably some more of this theme that we've already been seeing that happens. But again, personally, this can be really activate a big push forward with what you want to be developing and everything.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, we got out of Capricorn season. We had this push of, cardinal Earth, and we're figuring all these things out. Now we're emerging, and all of a sudden we have to maybe fixate on the idea. We have to communicate it where we are to the world at large, and our place in society there. The full moon in Leo always kind of pits us against like, your own feelings in relation to the rest of the, your place in the rest of society, what you have to give back, etc. And so I feel like there could be some tension and unexpected movements of people being like, maybe like I've had it, or I want to do this now, and I am redirecting, like this is the final redirect, to some extent. If you've been thinking about it and feeling the crunch for so long with the Saturn square Uranus, it's like Gray said, this is kind of that last lunation that's really just like, all right, you gonna do it or what? Like that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, I mean, we are going to still have eclipses in Scorpio and Taurus this next year that will activate Uranus, but we won't have Saturn in Aquarius. So I really like what you're just saying. I think that's the main takeaway here in this Aquarius period is what is this some of the resolution of the Saturn Uranus drama that we've been dealing with the last couple of years. hopefully, I don't know how much, collective events just keep spiraling out of control sometimes, but personally, especially like things that you've been wanting to get together and things have been changing, that really helps with like, I think part of this year, you know, going into the next part of that story and things kind of wrapping up and expanding into whatever's coming next with those developments.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about the new moon energies and how we have Venus conjunct Saturn at that
Mm-hmm.
time. And we know what Venus conjunct Saturn last year looked like when it was like caught in between the malefics, between Mars and Saturn. And luckily that's not the case for Venus this year, but she had a rough year. She had a rough 2022. So it'll be interesting to watch her moves. But by the time we get to that full moon, Venus will be in Pisces, which will not be nice. She'll be exalted in her position there.
I think the only other thing would be, I mean, she'll eventually get to Neptune, I think, by that end of Aquarius time. So we'll have another one of those Venus, Neptune, Pisces periods we've had for years now. But with Mercury's movement right here, you can see on your chart there, it's coming back. So, Mercury, it just is good by this. What's interesting about this transit, Mercury starts kind of near Pluto, and then it comes back retrograde to like sextile Neptune and trine Uranus. So it's basically finishing up these aspects, where it'll finish that Neptune aspect, it'll finish that Pluto aspect like you're showing there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that Mercury retrograde storyline is basically also wrapping up here on that kind of shorter cycle level. So whatever was kind of happening during that Mercury retrograde is finishing up right here too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a good point. Yeah, because I think we didn't kind of say with the Mercury, we alluded to Mercury trining Uranus during its cycles, but in this particular one too, it started with a sextile to Neptune.
Neptune,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So it's also interesting in the creative form and, kind of imagineering and like that, the earth magic and what we're putting into place. So
Yeah, I like the earth magician thing.
yeah, we're all going to be earth magicians. Why not? Let's do it. So yeah, so we get to Jupiter's moving along in Aries here. It's already at almost 8 degrees here by February 10th. And as Gray pointed out, we got that Venus conjunct Neptune, which is always nice. I will say though, it'll be interesting to think about once we get there, February 15th. I mean, Venus conjunct Neptune was one of the main configurations for that solar eclipse that happened last year. And so now Venus is coming back to this point. So it'll just be interesting, side note, put in your pocket for later. Wondering.
Yeah, it's a bit of that Jupiter. I mean, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is like Saturn coming into Pisces and solidifying whatever kind of formless vision, things that maybe didn't quite cohere with the Jupiter Neptune. But I think the important thing, people that are down on Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces is that it is very internal, and there might be a lot more going on underneath the surface of things than you realized. And this would be on a little mini level. Yeah, Venus is she's going to go from Neptune, and as we head into the Pisces season, she's going to go into Aries, and we're going to get this Venus Jupiter conjunction in Aries. So there's a way she's tying those two back together again.
Yeah. And speaking of the tie-in too, here we have at the same time around mid-month in February, or at least kind of mid-month, and only has 28 days, but the sun is going to be meeting Saturn and kind of finishing its bridge of the gap from the square to Uranus to conjunct Saturn. And granted, Mercury is going to come about this way, but really these are the final planets that are contacting Saturn in Aquarius.
It's a good point. This would be a nice time to do your well, maybe not on Valentine's Day if you're celebrating romantically or something, but February 15th and the next day, like if you want to do some Saturn in Aquarius retrospective of, get out some journals or whatever you want to do and think about, how are you shaped by Saturn in Aquarius. This would be a great time to do that, like middle of February.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great idea. Because we're gonna know by then. If it hadn't been clear, it'll be clear by February 16th, basically. So we're getting to the end of that final hurrah there. And that really brings us to the end of Aquarius season. So let us go on to Pisces territory, which begins on February 18th. February 18th. So let's think Pisces season. Like you said, Gray, we have that Venus conjunct Jupiter in Aries. And we have Mercury conjuncting Saturn the same day. So once again, to tie in that, because Mercury will be, I think, the final one, or at least by conjunction for sure, to contact Saturn. Obviously, we have Saturn ingressing into Pisces then, which we know is big news. We have Jupiter conjuncting Chiron. And mid-March is Neptune central. We have Mars making its final square to Neptune, while the Sun and Mercury make a superior cazimi on Neptune, basically around the same time. And we have Venus squaring Pluto at that time too. So there's kind of a lit up period in mid-March between March 16th and 17th. So let's see here. Let me, I guess, since the lunations are at the beginning, might as well just skip to our Pisces new moon on February 20th.
Go to the Pisces new moon. That'd be great. Yeah, so we go into, this is the part of the year where this is when the new story really emerges to me, because in Pisces, you can see Saturn's at the very end of Aquarius. So we are right before Saturn goes into Pisces, and it's not really too far into Aries season that Pluto goes into Aquarius. I mean, by the end of March, Pluto will be in Aquarius. So we during Pisces season, we get the Saturn changing sign, and we get to like Pluto at the very, very, very end of Capricorn, about to change signs. Something we have not talked about that I think might be under the radar. I mean, maybe people are talking about this in forecasts, I'm not sure, but that Jupiter Chiron conjunction, I mean, that actually is a fairly significant cycle that I personally haven't done tons of research on, but the last time they were together was back in 2009, when they were all in it was in Aquarius along with Neptune. And if people just want to look at this on their own, we had 2009, 1990, which the 1991 in Cancer really lined up with all that dissolution of the Soviet Union, with coming after that Saturn Neptune. That's you probably know people personally or have worked with people in astrology that have Jupiter and Chiron and Cancer opposite that, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, and Capricorn. Before that was 1976, and that was the last one in Aries, and Mars was also in Gemini, sextile that.
Sounds like you have done some research, Gray.
I've done a little, no, but I haven't seriously studied it.
Thought about it,
yeah, about all the, but it's a cycle, and I think speaking to what we are talking about, people taking their power back, in this, maybe it's idea of like agency with Aries, and maybe part of that wound of Chiron and Aries so far is people feeling like, what can I even do, and I'm being thwarted, and I can't, at one point people being literally like locked down, not able to leave their home, because Chiron's basically been in Aries this whole time. We've been dealing with all of this.
That's true.
This is very much to me like this kind of like Jupiter, Chiron, and Aries, like kind of leading us, out of this period, into this new story. And I don't know if you want to go forward a little bit, we get, forget what day it is, but we get basically Venus comes into Aries, and we get a Venus Jupiter conjunction in Aries pretty soon after this, and that's very close to Chiron. So before Jupiter before Jupiter and Chiron actually come together, they're like on the cusp of it, right? Venus comes through and she actually connects them. So this really makes me think about actually a little bit, we go back to that last time we had Jupiter Chiron come together in Aries with Mars and Gemini, 1976. That is birth of punk rock and hip hop, and creative art forms of people taking power back, making statements, creating culture. This looks very much like that to me. And something you don't have on here that is you have to be into asteroids. But what happens after this, what's interesting is Vesta. So Vesta's in Aries, and when by the time Jupiter moves a little bit forward to get to Chiron, Vesta comes through in Aries. Okay, here we go. Thank you. So then we get Vesta is in Aries too. So I think that's actually interesting that if you go a little bit further, you don't have to on this, but if you want to just show people, when we get to like the Jupiter Chiron conjunction, Vesta is very close together with them. So we actually have a bit of like, I think there is something to say about the fact that it's not just Jupiter Chiron, it's Jupiter Vesta Chiron with Venus sort of mixing something up right as they're all coming together. And so this also makes me think about, Vesta can be very communal in a sense of, especially when we think about Hestia, which is also often associated with Vesta being like a Romanized name of Hestia and like the sacred fire, keeping your sacred fire, Aries being the exaltation of the sun, with Jupiter Chiron being there. Vestas can be very excelling at really focusing in on something like a laser, whatever your own sense of spiritual practices are, or even thinking about sort of the spirit, someone who's like a spiritual warrior in some sort of sense, or like the renegade priestess or monk that's out,
renegade priestess. I like that. Would be my WWE character.
Yeah. So this is where we get the renegade priestess joining the Earth magician in the as we come towards the Aries equinox. Yeah. So anyway, I like this as far as and this is like right. So you can see here, this is literally Saturn's just gone into Pisces. So that's just why I'm saying Jupiter's ruling Saturn. Saturn's just gone into Pisces. We actually get a full moon right around here too. So there's something about this Jupiter Chiron that is very much about initiating us into this new story, which is really all about Saturn, Neptune ultimately.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, talk about Earth magician. I feel like when we have a Virgo full moon, that is very Earth magician-esque because life is literally shifting on a very physical, tangible way at this time of year. And, we are in Pisces season. This is a mutable, double-bodied energy. And so this is where things start to, as we talk about, dissolve and reform and kind of start to take the shape of what's next. Any mutable period is going to be about that, but the one from Pisces to Aries is very significant because it lights us up with a Virgo full moon and then brings us straight to the beginning of the zodiac. And to think at this full moon on March 7th, we got Pluto at an anaretic 29 degree. We got Saturn, literally the last degree, last minute.
The last minute.
It is the last minute.
I mean, it's even close. I mean, because later this day, Saturn goes into Pisces. So, I mean, it's I didn't look up the timing, but must be like hours later or something. It goes into Pisces.
It's like, talk about an entrance.
Yeah. But it's a full moon. It's like even if it's not the exact full moon, I mean, it's close enough where we can say when Saturn goes into Pisces, it's going to be a full moon in Virgo. Yeah. Really lighting it up.
Well, and then we look at
by Mercury in Pisces. So yeah.
Yeah. And if we look at just this chart just happens to be set for Washington and it has descendant literally on Jupiter almost to the minute.
That's amazing. I didn't realize that. I hadn't looked at that chart.
So this is going to be an intriguing period. And when I said the last minute, the term that came to my head was in the last hour, because a lot of times you think about Pisces actually as being in Jupiter to this point of like miracles too, where something just pulls out of, just saves you out of nowhere. Like in the 7th hour, it came in and got, I don't know if I'm exaggerating here, but it feels like some things can shift where all of a sudden in just like that last minute of something all kind of like coagulates and redistributes.
Totally. And speaking of like the sort of magical connection, I'm noticing, I hadn't actually realized this, but it's nice to see this chart. That full moon is actually Antisha, all the Aries. So
Yeah.
Virgo and Aries form that, and it's by almost by degree. So that full moon actually is really connecting, is really going to tie in the Jupiter Chiron conjunction in an interesting way that I hadn't noticed before. Antisha just brings things together that maybe it looks like they're not really in an aspect, but they actually are brought together into an aspect, and they're actually like, it's brought together. So yeah, I think what you just said, that
especially the trine to Uranus.
The way you describe that is what I works for that aspect, and that's why I think I noticed it while you were saying that. The other thing is we didn't talk about, but just really quickly, is if people are looking at this chart, you can see that you have the Egyptian bounds on it. So right before Saturn goes into Pisces, what is interesting is by essential dignity, this is just an off the chart strong Saturn. So there probably is something big about the Saturn resolution story, because Saturn has triplicity, domicile, and bound dignity here at the end. So this is like a, if essential, whatever essential dignity means by transits, this is like super strong Saturn, as powerful as it can be, basically. It's kind of like Mars at the beginning of a Scorpio. Yeah.
So definitely pay attention to that. Oh, what's my camera doing? Okay, so let us move on. And just like FYI, if there wasn't enough with this full moon on March 7th, it's another one, much like the January one, that is configured to Uranus. So we have this Uranian piece also coming in. So we know this is big, and it leads us into that Neptune period that I was mentioning.
Oh, right. Yeah. So we can sort of see, as you're pulling it up, Mercury's in Pisces. It's on the other side of the sun from us. That means Mercury's moving really fast. So it's going to fly through Pisces. And by the end of Pisces season, yeah, you can see here, Mercury's really close. This is what, March 14th?
So March 14th is when Mars squares Neptune, and then we just keep moving it forward, and Mercury will cross over Neptune. And then,
let's talk about that just for a second. That's actually huge, because one of the major storylines of the Mars retrograde in Gemini has been a square to Neptune.
Exactly.
And so I know a lot of people have thought about all the chaotic feelings about the Twitter takeover, kind of went with that, and Twitter files being released. But this is the end of that. And so Mars is actually coming out of its retrograde shadow here, also squaring Neptune, with its ruler Mercury also being there, going into its superior conjunction. So that Mercury going through its superior conjunction in Pisces.
Well, and Mars squaring, or Sun square Mars at this time too. So it's all those
Sun squaring
things.
Mars too. Yeah. So it's a big part of the Mars synodic cycle. Mercury heading through there. I mean, on one hand, you could be like, oh, maybe this is really disorienting with Mercury and Pisces and Neptune. But as Mercury goes through that superior conjunction, we finally are out of this Mars and Neptune exact thing. I kind of think this could really maybe bring some clarity regarding whatever, the bigger Mars retrograde storyline and what all has happened, because Mercury is, reanimated and, reseated and everything when it hits the sun there.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that comes up in my mind when I look at this is, I mean, Mars being our action energy in this whole retrograde cycle, it was like, kind of popping the bubbles of like, what is feasible? What's not? What do I have energy for? What do I not? Like and then we talked about this disillusion, dissolving quality of Saturn and Pisces. And here Saturn's coming in, and all of a sudden, if you talk about getting the word or the message or the intuition that either something is dissolving and you don't have energy for it anymore, or perhaps you finally are animated by the actual dream of what the next dream is, and then you can take action on it. But it does seem to have this like if something were to dissolve, it now kind of feels like that time, or coming to terms with what has already dissolved. Or I know there's a lot of people in my personal life that are navigating grief for some reasons or another. So it
Yeah.
just seems like a really potent combination. Talk about soul searching moment. Just connecting with yourself and your energetic drive, and just checking back in with everything you've been through with the Mars retrograde, right? Much like you said with the checking in with the Saturn and Aquarius piece when the sun went over.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
I definitely think that is a great. I really like that, and especially with grief and things like that. The other thing I would say is that it's like Mercury often does, this can be doing multiple things at once. I think this is also, as we're just about to hit the Aries ingress, there's something really potent here about sort of seeding the Saturn Neptune, because basically earlier on, I think it's March 2nd, Mercury formed a conjunction with Saturn in Aquarius. Then it shoots, goes really fast through, and now it's hitting Neptune right before its superior conjunction. So there's something interesting to me about Mercury kind of threading bringing Saturn and Neptune sort of together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right as we go into the Aries ingress. Yeah. That is just, it's sort of just mixes that up. It kind of gets it going gives it a little bit more of a jump start.
Absolutely. And so what's nice about this period too is we have Venus moving into Taurus. So that's always a lovely little thing. And she's heading towards the north node
and
there.
Saturn is no longer in Aquarius. So this is the first time we get, okay, now Saturn's in Venus's exaltation and they're in a sextile. And yeah, so it's a very different Venus and Taurus here than we've been dealing with recently.
Yeah. And if we think about it, because Mercury, like you said, conjuncted Saturn in Aquarius and then just bolted right through. I mean, Venus is our first one to make a Ptolemaic aspect to Saturn there. So she might have she might be delivering a Saturn in Pisces. It just feels very form bearing.
It is. It's very, it's very, very pregnant or fertile here, I feel like, because it's also kind of interesting that she'd be going right into the north node of the moon
at the same
time as she makes that aspect and then she's heading towards Uranus. So there's that's what we get in the next part coming up.
And so this brings us to the Aries ingress. And we're just going to spend like I don't know, let's do like 5 minutes or less, Gray, on talking about the Aries ingress as a whole. Let's get our initial impressions, because we're on a nice flow. I feel like we're in a good flow with our planetary seasons.
Is this the
Oh, I don't know. Why am I skipping years? I don't know. I am trying to just get to 2024. What's that saying? I was ahead of myself. All right. So March 20th, 2023, which technically at 5:24 p.m. Washington time is our Aries ingress there. And that Venus North Node conjunction is right there.
So that is something. If you remember last year when we did this forecast, we talked about being worried about what did happen. We were worried about Roe versus Wade because Venus was in the 9th house in Aquarius, in between Mars and Saturn, squaring Uranus. This year, she's in the 9th house. She's ruling the 9th house. She's moving away from a received sextile with Saturn, heading towards a received conjunction with Uranus. So this looks a lot better for Venus.
She's in much better condition.
Yeah,
she's
it's very different.
Hallelujah.
It's very, very different. Extremely different. Yeah. And I mean, one thing, this is just something that's going to be going on everywhere. And it's another thing that makes me think about the Saturn Neptune conjunction again. It's just that we're all going to have this moon Neptune. So there's something about the people. It's going to show up in different charts everywhere. The USA chart, there's something around maybe foreign relationships or something, but moon Neptune everywhere. And so there's a lot that can be said about that. But I think interestingly, one thing is just it's to me also just kind of getting that Saturn Neptune thing again really set in motion. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting to have Mars configured to that at the same time.
Yeah.
Because and granted it's leaving, but it's still there. So which is interesting to think about because we were just talked about a very potent period right before this happens, where Mars leaves its, shadow, essentially squares Neptune. We have all that Pisces energy that leads up into this moment. So it makes me wonder what takes place at that time that kind of like crystallizes in this moment as that like fresh start that is related to Neptunian themes or Piscean themes of some sort.
And obviously, Moon Neptune can also go with stuff around. We were talking before about sort of like propaganda and people being caught up in there. I mean, stuff that's already happening. I think we've had some other Moon Neptune, or maybe it was Mercury Neptune. I feel like in previous Aries ingress charts there was something going on with Neptune, and I'm not remembering now that I started talking about it. One thing we don't need to do right now for time, but just to throw it out there for people to do on their own time, is one thing I did do is
I
put that ingress chart around the 2020 ingress chart, and I think I was using Placidus, and I was like, wow, okay, there's a bunch of hits on just because of that 2020 ingress chart being the ingress before the Jupiter Saturn conjunction. It's kind of a big deal. And okay, they are going to bring it up.
I'm like, how fast and efficient can I do this without sharing other people's data?
I don't have a super great interpretation of that, but I feel like I heard I need to look back at my notes, but I feel like it was Ben Dykes I heard giving a talk that talked about this, that you could use that in some text, and I don't know if it was Abu Mashar or somebody else, I don't remember the reference, but that you could use somebody like Abu Mashar, it might not be Abu Mashar, who was involved in like really talking about the Saturn Jupiter conjunctions, that you could take that ingress chart and then use that, other charts around it in subsequent Aries ingress charts, like as like a root chart, right? It's like that 2020 Aries ingress chart being the sort of like important radical.
Look at the switch between Venus and Uranus, like exactly.
Almost. Yeah, that was one thing. And yeah, there's a bunch of, I was like, whoa, there's like a lot.
Yeah, Venus is on Uranus's degree and vice versa. If you're not watching this, you're probably like, what are they talking about? So
you have here flip it the other way though for a second. So the 2020 is on the inside, but that anyway. So yeah, that's one of the things. Well, the Saturn in Pisces is where the Mercury was in that chart.
Oh, the moon is on where Neptune.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That was one. Yep. So it really makes that
Pluto on Saturn.
Like,
exactly.
Yes. Yep.
Almost by the minute.
Yeah, there's a bunch of hits. So
I lost Gray. He disappeared. So and he's back. He's the Earth magician that drops in and drops out.
Wow, I'm glad I got back in. I don't know what just happened.
You got in quick. That was fast.
Yeah. Well, that's what we Earth.
You were talking about Neptune, and then
yeah, exactly.
He disappeared.
That's exactly it.
Well, maybe we should move on.
You can ponder that element on your own time.
Yeah, you can ponder. That's too funny. All right. Well, if you're just listening to us, Gray literally popped out of it, just disappeared from the Zoom call, and then it was back in the fastest I've ever seen anybody get back into a call. So that was magic. All right. Well, we are in Aries season. Yeah, I mean Aries season. It's Aries season, this is this breath of fresh spring, at least if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, but we have that cardinal fire, and this is no ordinary Aries season. We have two new moons in Aries, one being on the 0 degree Aries world point, which I guess I can just bring up right now because it's literally the following day, March 21st. And then we finish the season with our first eclipse, solar eclipse at 29 degrees of Aries.
Yeah.
On an anaretic degree, which should be interesting. We also have Pluto ingressing into Aquarius, which we have talked about, and activating that Jupiter-Saturn degree. We have Mars finally leaving Gemini and moving into Cancer there. We have a full moon in Libra, which is going to be near Chiron. And we just spoke about Jupiter Chiron action earlier there. Venus will move between Taurus and Gemini. And of course, we'll have that Sun Jupiter conjunction to look at there too. So there's just so much fresh in this to me, Gray. What do you think?
Yeah, I feel like we've talked a lot about the themes. Just in the interest of time, we don't have to dwell on them over again here. But a lot of the stuff we already were talking about is about this year is happening now. So Saturn is starting to establish itself in Pisces. It's like a couple days after this that Pluto goes into Aquarius. It's like, I think March 23rd or 24th.
23rd.
23rd. And a couple of days after that, Mars goes into Cancer. So, Mars has been in Gemini since, was it in August? I'm trying to remember now.
I want to say like August 20th or somewhere around there.
Yeah. So Mars has been in Gemini forever. We finally get probably the most excited people will ever be for Mars to enter Cancer, which is the fall of Mars.
You're like, I know it's gonna fall, but just give me anything else but Gemini.
Yeah, and we do get the Mars trine of Saturn that comes in right away. But yeah, so this is where like there's a definite this is where we're really getting that new story coming in.
Yeah, and I think that Mars
it's very like Aries. It's so Aries. It's like right after the Aries ingress. It's just like it's really empowered. It's like, damn, yeah.
Yeah, it's because before we even get to that, basically we have that first quarter moon in Cancer, and right at the time that Mars is trining Saturn, which I think is very big, right? Because much like Mars squaring Neptune, Mars trine Saturn was part of the retrograde cycle too. And so it's interesting to have their final meeting be in two completely, not being in a whole different element, right? It's going to have a different flavor to it. Absolutely. But even though Mars is in fall here, and it is going to have its challenges, its watery challenges, its emotional challenges, it's still a cardinal sign. So we take it, Mars is out of this airy back and forth heady domain, and it is in the realm of feeling and intuition and, just cardinal is moving forward. So there is this burst of Aries energy taking place, cardinal first quarter moon. We have Pluto introducing a whole new dynamic into the picture. So you can't really, and then Venus on Uranus, like
the Venus Uranus additional thing really
take it at home.
It takes it home, makes it even really adds and like sort of like punctuates that just like break out into this new thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can bet between the Aries ingress on the 20th of March to the end of March, March 30th, give or take, like, wow. Probably in my opinion, one of the most dynamic setups of just opening energy of the whole entire year in many respects.
Yeah, when Pluto changes signs, I mean, last time Pluto changed signs into Capricorn, that was I was into astrology then. That was the first time I was ever aware of I believe, pretty much I got into astrology when Pluto into the 90s when Pluto's in Sagittarius, and that was the first time I was ever able to see what happens. And there was big things with Pluto's into Capricorn last time. I remember there was a whole economic fallout that happened
almost to the day. Like it was such a it was big. I mean,
yeah. And so and I feel like with the Pluto and Aquarius, like we talked about earlier, we're already starting to see stuff already is like popping up already. Like what I forget what that thing is called again. Is it Neuralink that Elon Musk has been killing lots of animals, testing for a while, where it's like putting like computer chips in the human brain or human head.
I don't even want to know
They just
that.
announced recently that there was new developments about that.
God help us.
To so there's stuff like that where, you know, we kind of know it's coming, but there's like we just talked about that fusion thing. There's sort of like announced like, hey, this is going to be coming later.
Yeah.
Like stuff we can kind of associate with Pluto and Aquarius. We're already seeing that entering the news, current events, and
It's like future shock.
But in your life, I guess, for those that do whole sign, it's pretty easy because this activates a new house in your chart and a whole new theme. So that's one thing you can think about. And I think just in general, for all of us, we're going to notice something something changing here. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels really dynamic too, just at this time period as well, as we get situated in this, like that Mars Saturn trine is essentially kind of forming a kite-like aspect with the nodes.
Oh yeah. That's the other huge thing is Pluto's already in range of a square to the nodes.
Yes.
But this brings them into like that whole sign square aspect. And they actually don't exactly square till, you know, Pluto goes back to Capricorn and nodes switch. But that's a big theme of the year. It's going to be Pluto. We didn't talk about that earlier. Pluto.
We should have talked about that. That
Pluto,
is a big theme.
Pluto at the southern bending of the nodes. And so this issue of power and people taking their power back is going to really come up. And I didn't mention this earlier, but just because this came up now, something about Pluto, I'm just going to mention is my first astrology teacher, Rosie Finn, for over a decade, has been researching and writing a book on the cycle of Pluto going out of bounds by declination. And the times where it does this has involved Pluto in Aquarius and Pluto in Leo for a long time. And sometimes it stretches into other signs. But it won't happen until I think 2026, or maybe it's the end of 2025 when I was looking at that. It won't be for a few years until Pluto goes out of bounds. But while Pluto's in Aquarius, it will go out of bounds again. But what's really interesting is she figured out that this is going to, because of the weird orbit of Pluto, for thousands of years it's been doing this. It was out of bounds, for example, back when one of the ones I remember is when Socrates was alive and Socrates was like killed and all that turmoil was going on. Pluto was out of bounds declination back then. It's been a thing that's been happening with human history for a while, this whole era we've been in. And after this time, I think it goes from like 2026 to 2032 or so, I want to say. It'll be dipping in out of bounds or not a little bit, but it won't go too much out of bounds. And it won't again for like 3,000 years. There's something weird about, there's this weird Pluto out of bounds thing that's going to end. And one of the things she's found with this is when this is different than lunar node, but what it reminds me of when the moon's at the southern bendings, the moon is low in latitude. Declination is different, of course, because it involves the celestial equator. Mm-hmm. But Pluto in Aquarius actually goes out of bounds, but in a southern direction. And she's found that the revolutions often have a little bit more people taking their power back. But anyway, I just think that theme of power over people, there's so much fear. And the one thing about the conspiracy theories that everybody gets upset about, what a lot of those people to me are perceiving is the threat of a totalitarian air age police state, right? I mean, if at the heart of it, that's what a lot of it's about. And it's not like that isn't impossible that could happen, right? Yeah. So like either
I know it's true.
So it's like this is an issue that I just feel like is getting set off, you know, with that lunar node square, and it's just sort of like a theme of this Pluto and Aquarius transit. And what it's likely we're going to have some sort of more. There are already revolutions happening, but there'll be likely stuff like that happening. Saturn, Neptune tend to go with that. So this is just that theme getting introduced this year, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, we're going to hold our drink for that because I think there's a time period coming up that we could elaborate on that just a little bit more. And I think you might know what that is too, but we'll save that because there are going to be Pluto activations coming up here shortly. So in Aries season, we have that full moon in Libra, which is going to happen on April 6th. That is configured. You smack dab in the middle of Chiron and Jupiter. So we were talking about Chiron and Jupiter earlier. You know, there I feel there can be a revisit to that theme, especially relational, right? And because this is our relational full moon that we get every year when we're like, hello, Libra.
And for the first time in a long time, it won't have a square aspect to Pluto and Capricorn.
Oh
now,
my God.
so that's something different
that
about
is
this
big.
one.
That is big. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a long time that that's been the case.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of excited about that.
Yeah.
Now I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about all my moon Pluto square moments, especially having the moon square Pluto in my chart in Capricorn and Libra.
Right.
So having the Pluto and Capricorn the whole time, it was like, oh, you're just revisiting.
And you have a Libra moon or a Libra sun or a Libra something else, and Pluto's been squaring it. Yeah, I mean it's a big change with this.
Yeah, you can do a happy dance right
So this
now.
will be, I mean, that might be nice. This might be a nice celebration for people with significant Libra placements, this full moon in some way.
Yeah, or maybe even cardinal placements all together. You know, like finally taking getting a little bit of that. Fixed people are like, oof, but you know, anyways, this feels like a nice full moon just because of the Jupiter connection here. And like you said, taking off the pressure there. So I do want to skip ahead because I know we're trying to summarize to
want to go to this eclipse.
Yes, let's get to this eclipse real quick.
Eclipse.
So we'll have an eclipse on April 20th, 12:12 a.m. Washington. And as you can see by the chart, it is at 29 degrees and 50 minutes of Aries. Now, granted, this is, you know, the nodes are still in Taurus and Scorpio, but I mean, it's only less than 5 degrees off there. Gray, do you have any thoughts about just out of sign eclipses when the eclipse itself is in a different sign from the nodes?
I mean, I consider them still to be an eclipse. I know
it's definitely eclipse. I'm just wondering if
I mean, I guess that wasn't the right phrasing. Sorry. I mean, I don't think it's the impact of the eclipse is personally. I don't feel it's lessened because the node's in a different sign. I think
solar hybrid.
Yeah, I think it'll be a very impactful eclipse. And what's interesting is, you know, I do believe in whole sign aspects. I don't think, but it's one of the things where actually, you know, you might be, oh, that's whole sign sextile Pluto and Aquarius, but actually it's squaring Pluto.
Oh, it is squaring Pluto.
Really closely, because it's only 10 minutes from Taurus. I mean, it's so close to being a Taurus eclipse.
It's less than a degree.
And Pluto's only like 19 minutes into Aquarius. Yeah, it's less than a
degree. It is totally
it's like 39 arc minutes. less than 40 arc minutes away from one another. So
literally the first aspect that the moon is going to make after it, right?
it'll square Pluto. So I think this goes to me a lot about what I was just speaking about as sort of kicking off this like empowerment of Aries types of things. I like that Jupiter is pretty close to the eclipse. So Jupiter's in there in Aries with the eclipse.
We got Mercury Uranus together.
So the thing to think about is in your chart, wherever you have Aries or Aries placements, this is introducing even though it's so close to Taurus, it's still activating Aries. So there's this whole new Aries theme that is going to be coming in this year. And it's not till later in the year that they're going to switch, but we get to switch to like the North Node being in Aries, which is another reason this year to me has a lot to do with this kind of like, you know, being able to kind of push through and make some growth and create a lot more new movement and things happening for you.
Yeah. So, and keep in mind, this is the second Aries. It's new moon. It's, it's like, and it's kind of like what I found in in 2021 when we had back to back Leo, or no, was it Leo? It was Aquarius full moons when we were in Leo season. And it's like the first one sets up the story, and then the second one comes around and like kicks it off further. So it's like we can spend this whole season and all its dynamic changes getting to this point, which is really a strong kickoff, especially in relation to the square to Pluto, Mercury and Uranus forming a conjunction together. We got Saturn sextile the nodes, sextile the north node, pretty almost exact. So yeah, there's freshness, there's power dynamics, there is potential verbalized revolt in some way, with the Mercury Uranus conjunction.
This, I mean, there could be something tough on collective events, maybe like world leaders. I mean, it would kind of go with the theme that I was talking about. Sometimes they get these like people revolts, like world leaders getting toppled, or celebrities or big figures, just because it's like the exaltation of the sun being eclipsed, right? So
yeah, that makes
there's
sense with the
qualities
square to
with that.
Pluto.
Yeah, and squaring Pluto, right?
On the, because once again, just reiterating that is the Jupiter Saturn conjunction point. So the whole time it's sitting there for is activating something larger, a much larger cycle that is underway too. And so there's definitely power dynamics going on. But in the life of just us lay people, this might be the big change, the start of a big change.
It would be a theme of big change, because even though, again, like you're saying, it's a hybrid eclipse, so the nodes are still in a fixed sign, because the eclipse is falling in Aries, it initiates us into this cardinal thing. And the cardinal eclipse is just like traditional astrology definition. And for most simplistic level, it is like fast change, right? Just like some new things are coming in, change is happening. It's a cardinal sign eclipse, where we've been in these fixed sign eclipses, which are more about these big, like long-term changes.
Moving changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So speaking of slower moving, let us move on to Taurus season. We have Taurus season starting literally the same day as the eclipse.
Same day.
So April 20th, once again, we have Taurus
so I mean, it's
season.
interesting that before the moon even gets to the north node, the sun's already in Taurus. So it's definitely got that cuspy kind of Taurus feel to it.
Yeah, there's serious cusp action here. So Taurus season, we get another Mercury retrograde in Taurus. Of course, we have the lunar eclipse in Scorpio that will follow, because we are in eclipse season here. We have Pluto, who will go retrograde, just as it got a taste of Aquarius. It's like, that's enough. I am ready to turn around. We have Jupiter ingressing into Taurus, which is also big news.
Yeah.
And really big news, because it's going to square that Pluto at a 0 degree, a fixed sign. And then we're going to have Mars ingressing into Leo, and we'll also start to form a T-square with that configuration. So the end of Taurus season and the beginning of Gemini season is pretty impactful. So, and keep in mind too, we just had a switch here, right? We saw for the first part of 2023 and the end of 2022, all of the new moons were starting at the early degrees of signs. And so now we're going to be switching to these lunations that have new moons at the very end of signs. So that's in itself as a switch. I mean, just to think about in general, if you kind of practice like just degree energy, and the idea of like, beginnings, mills, and ends, that's something to think about. But all right, so what is first on this roster?
I think the big thing here, and is mainly the Mercury retrograde, and then the Jupiter ingress to me, and so right after that, really soon after this, what is it, like the next
It's to
day?
21st.
The
Oh,
next
so
day,
Mercury's
Mercury,
stationing the whole time during the
yeah.
eclipse.
Oh, right. We should have said
We
that. Yeah.
probably should have said that.
Yeah. So Mercury is stationing. So that makes me think it's adding that in, yeah, a real volatile eclipse,
Well, and the
even more
moon
so.
is conjunct it right when it. Okay, so that's
Mm.
interesting. I just want to pull back and just touch on this real quick, especially since we're at Mercury retrograde,
Hmm.
because Mercury was configured to Uranus in that eclipse, but it never makes it there. It, you
Mm.
know, it,
Yeah, it
and
doesn't quite
we
make it there.
it doesn't quite make it there. And we talk about Mercury being in this relation to Uranus during its retrogrades. But interestingly enough, it's like it gets a taste of this energy and
Yeah.
this fusion, but it just doesn't quite get there.
It
So
doesn't
it's
get there, but it's enough to there'll be a Uranian quality to
oh,
the
absolutely.
stationing, but you're right that it won't really, there's something that doesn't get completed until
Till it
later
comes
on.
back around. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the following day should be quite interesting, having Mercury station with the moon conjunct it right as it stations, and then bridging the gap to Uranus. So talk about surprise the next day. It's like
Yeah.
lunar solar eclipse, and the next day you're like, oh, this. Okay.
Yeah. So I think one thing I think about this image wise is because remember we were mentioning Jupiter's going to go into Taurus, and that happens when May 16th. So it's a few weeks later that Jupiter goes into Taurus, but Mercury stations retrograde here. I was sort of thinking about like Mercury helping to like, kind of like prepare the soil. You think about Taurus being very earthy and fertile
Yeah.
soil. Like, so there's some about Mercury kind of tilling the soil, preparing this Taurus area, for Jupiter to come in. And it again will be another retrograde Earth sign for Mercury with that Uranian quality. So it's definitely dealing with more practical things in your life and tangible things and making changes around that. And being in a fixed sign, it makes me think too, a little bit more like maybe getting out of, sometimes Taurus can be, I love Taurus, but sometimes they can get kind of stuck, like with their habits and stuff. So it's kind of like maybe shaking up some old habits and things you need to change.
I think that that's an astute way of looking at it, especially in regards to, Venus is hanging out in Gemini. And so it kind of loosens up the Taurus energy there, and she's navigating those Mars retrograde degrees. So perhaps there's kind of themes that come back in around that time. And your Vesta story is back with the
Yeah, there's Vesta
Sun,
back
Vesta,
there.
and North Node all conjunct on the same day. Because that's the thing too, is we're going to have all these planets start to conjunct the North Node as they go into Taurus. So
Right.
that will be a big part of it. But let us
So the next
carry
thing,
on.
yeah, I was
Go
gonna say
ahead.
maybe May 1st, because around May 1st, which is, a lot of times people celebrate Beltane that day, traditionally, but it's also speaking of all the labor movements and possible strikes and things like that of that nature. It is May Day. Mercury, that can be the Mercury
Conjunction.
Sun, yeah, and that's the same day that basically Pluto stations retrograde. So that's a big point. So
Yeah.
at the same time, Mercury's again getting that reanimation and really some reseeding of new ideas for the season ahead. Pluto is extremely activated and stationing at that 0 Aquarius point. So we can imagine it's a big
It's
pivot
a
point or change point or whatever you want
It
to say.
is,
Yeah.
and we have to pull it back and realize that we're in eclipse season, right? So what's going to
Yeah, it's in between
happen?
eclipses, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we're going to get to the point where the moon is going to ingress into Scorpio right before its eclipse. It's going to square that recently stationed Pluto, and activate the nodes there, and then make its lunar eclipse on Cinco de Mayo on May 5th, 1:34 p.m. Eastern. So yeah, there's this big kind of like in between lead up. So we start with that eclipse, and then, Pluto stations, Mercury is stationed, Jupiter is getting to the edge of Aries. And we have this Uranian eclipse on May 5th. So once again, that Mercury bridging the gap and almost getting to Uranus, talking with the sun about it, and then the sun coming around and connecting on the eclipse in the days after when the sun makes its conjunction to Uranus.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me about this, sort of what you're just saying, is again speaking about the ideas of like movement and big change happening, is that we get another eclipse activating Uranus, because this is really close to Uranus, but that we no longer have the Saturn square. So there is something as on the one, we're going to have one more Taurus eclipse, lunar eclipse after this later in the year. So this is starting to, resolve these Scorpio eclipse storylines that have been going on the last couple of years. Taurus and Scorpio eclipses were like the end of 2021 and all through 2022. But there's something even more purely, I guess, Uranian about this. This is more like Uranus, more just like unhinged and not getting that Saturn square. Yeah,
I know, right? It doesn't have the limitation or that voice of reason or that blockage there. It's like, no, I am fully autonomous. I am ruled by Venus in Gemini, who's a little it's interesting. Venus and Gemini and Mercury retrograde are they're in there. They're seeing not seeing one another, basically.
Yeah, and Venus is squaring on Neptune. So this is a pretty wild eclipse.
It is yeah, that too. So Neptune is back into the fray as well. This is a pretty wild eclipse. And we have to keep in mind that the moon in Scorpio is its fall position as well. So this can be a bit of a destabilizing eclipse, potentially emotionally, where some things can kind of come out of the blue, and maybe especially like relationally, thinking about Venus and socially.
The one super, definitely, I agree with what you're just saying because of Mars being in fall ruling the eclipse. But the one other, I guess, silver lining I would say is we have Mars in the exaltation of Jupiter, applying to a square with Mars in the home of, applying to a square with Jupiter in the home of Mars. So there's actual mutual reception with Jupiter's in the superior square, which actually means Jupiter is able to sort of improve the condition of that Mars. So that is a hopeful sign about this, that it could maybe, even if there's upsetting emotional things going on, that there's, kind of look for like, even if something upsetting is going on here, and kind of look for what is that silver lining, like what could this be, keep that in mind, that there could be something coming out of this in the end.
Well,
that's not as bad as it looks.
Yeah, no, I like that, because sometimes we're upset about something because maybe we're, speaking as a Cancer, maybe we're starting fresh. Maybe there's this whole new thing on the horizon, but I have to leave this thing I've known, or I'm separated from this, something I was attached to for a long time, because it's still a fixed eclipse here. And there's all this fresh energy that comes in, and sometimes we have to let go of things and release in order to move forward, and that's not always an easy experience too. So
yeah, definitely.
So this is really a lead up, right? Because we are cruising along here to
yeah, the only thing I was gonna say is right before we get to Gemini season, Mars goes into Leo and opposes Mars. I mean, Mars goes into Leo and opposes Pluto. I gotta stop.
Mars is opposing itself.
Yeah, Mars goes into Leo to oppose Pluto at 0 Aquarius.
Do you know what Mars opposing itself seems to me? It's like the saying, "You're your own worst enemy."
Yeah. Oh, we skipped, and then you're right. Jupiter going to Taurus. We didn't talk about that. Yeah. So May 16th. Yeah.
So let's do a lead up here, right? Let's get some perspective. We have May 16th. We have Jupiter moving into Taurus. So that's going to be a big shift, right? Because it doesn't go back into Aries.
No.
It is that period is over. We are in.
So there's definitely. Normally, I'd be saying this is like kind of like a slow, Jupiter's going to kind of slow it down a bit, and sure, probably so being in Taurus a bit, but it's like it goes into Taurus, the North Node is there, it's squaring Pluto, and then Mars comes into Leo to square it. So it's a
Yeah.
very propulsive entrance of Jupiter into Taurus. Yeah.
Yeah. This is big. This is especially as the moon crosses over it, what just when it happens too, which
Yeah,
is
that's interesting.
interesting. So the moon's going to light it up basically on May 17th. And yeah, so we basically have Jupiter ingressing to Taurus, it making a square with Pluto. Mars then moves on into Leo on the 20th to then make a square, an opposition with Pluto, and then a square to Jupiter on the 22nd here once Gemini season turns. So basically this bridge from Taurus season to Gemini season is lit up
Totally. Yeah.
with big world activity, right? Because once again, we're activating this very sensitive 0 degree of fixed signs point. So I bet, it's safe to say there can be very massive world stories going on here.
Definitely.
And so what's your initial what do you think? The Jupiter action seems to be kind of the pivot point within it all. And it's configured to the nodes too. So there's so much kind of like
Yeah.
seems very fateful, the whole
Yeah.
lineup.
Yeah. I know I mentioned, I mean, I feel like I'm kind of going to repeat myself, but it's big because of, to me, like I said before, Uranus being in Taurus. So even though they don't come together until 2024, we start getting this Jupiter Uranus quality picked up, which combining Jupiter with the north node of the moon, and Mercury has recently stationed direct and is moving forward now as a morning star in Taurus. It's really there's something very innovative here. So it's an extremely innovative type of Taurus quality, which is really fascinating because we think about Taurus, being able to really create beautiful forms and aesthetics. But this is a particularly something really a little bit more accelerated and innovative, and even like
large. It feels very
very
large,
large.
right?
Yeah.
Like it's large, it's intense, it is
Mm-hmm.
asks a lot of energy, to some extent. Like I feel
Yeah.
that this is a very big moment
And
where a lot of shifting pieces will start to move into more fixated points of being or residing, yeah.
yeah, probably a big world events or some turning point here. But the other thing would be that waxing sextile between Jupiter and Saturn, which doesn't come in until the solstice turning of the year, around the summer solstice or Cancer solstice. But they're now
They're getting introduced.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
that's really big. That takes us all the way back to that whole inception of a new cycle back at the end of 2020.
At
So
0 degrees of
0 degrees of
Aquarius.
Aquarius, which is where Pluto is, right? And Mars is opposite that point. So there's definitely something here about getting perspective about, I think it's a great statement actually for the whole year, but it's literally getting fired up here is like, what has this new Jupiter Saturn cycle been about for you? And what are you doing with it? What hasn't quite come into form yet? What else do you want to be doing here? Maybe just getting more of a realization about what have we been hit with? We've all been changed and reshaped in such massive ways in these past few years. Yeah.
That's true. That's true. I feel like this, if you aren't repositioning yourself and you haven't made it to the sextile point of Jupiter and Saturn, or that energy is in your life, it's definitely will be a big kick in the pants to the progress and the change that you need in your own life. And we're going to see things definitely shifting and reestablishing on the world stage. So
yeah, definitely.
And luckily we're going to be in Gemini season, so at least we'll be prepared. We'll be more adaptable, hopefully, or mentally. Well, not so yet with Mercury it's still in Taurus. So it's, Gemini season isn't fully Gemini quite yet. The sun comes in is like, But that's basically the start of Gemini season. We have the sun activating that Mars, because that's interesting too, is like when the sun moves in, the sun is forming a flowing aspects with that Pluto and Mars energy too. So
Yeah.
it's kind of mitigates all that tension between Mars, Jupiter, and Pluto. The sun is like, oh, here, let me show you the light,
Yeah.
to some extent. So I like that there. But of course, there's going to be mutable tension at play for the first time with the sun making a square to Saturn in Pisces. We have Jupiter going to conjunct the North Node, which seems very dynamic. Venus is going to activate, she's in Cancer and she's going to move into Leo and activate all that same point that Mars did as well.
Yeah, I think we could. I feel like you can
Kind
go
of
on. So we could
talk
kind of
about it
jump
and
to
keep
that.
moving.
We could kind of jump to that, but if you actually just realized you probably had more summary to go through
I
there.
do.
But
This is
yeah,
a big
go
Gemini's
through
got
the
a
rest
lot
of that.
going on, actually.
Yeah.
Because not only that, we have Pluto retrograding back into Capricorn, just as Mercury moves into Gemini, and they trine at 29 degrees of Earth signs before Mercury moves into Gemini. Saturn stations retrograde, and then that's when that Jupiter makes an opening sextile to Saturn on a new moon square Neptune on the Mars retrograde station degree. So Gemini season is really batting for one of the most dynamic. I mean, it's really it's a heavy hit, like Aries, Taurus, Gemini, like that whole spring season.
These all
just
are
lit up.
these all are active. Yeah. I prefer this kind of active to the past few years kinds of active, but yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. I
It
prefer
is
this.
it is dynamic though, but I like this is the kind of dynamic thing I'm more into this.
With.
I'm down with this.
So
The one thing I wanted to do really quick, and
yeah.
it is really quick, is on the way to Venus going into Leo, which I think is we should probably go to if we're talking about something. Just thinking about Venus and Cancer. I mean, this is like amazing. Again, I'm just thinking about how much Pluto changes the landscape. We've had every time, right? Pluto's been in Cancer, it's been opposite Pluto. At some point since like 2008.
And here she's like, "Ooh, I finally can relax at home."
Right. It's just like a straight shot through Cancer with
I can kick up my feet.
And there's no bad. I don't think there's any bad aspects she has in Cancer this time because like Saturn because
no, she's
Mars is already well actually at the beginning Mars is in Cancer, so Venus and Mars are in Cancer together, but then once Mars goes into Leo, she's just kind of in Cancer. She's trying.
She gets Saturn's a little Chiron tension, but other than
I guess
that,
Chiron. Okay,
yeah,
Chiron.
she's
fine. Yeah, it's a nice time. It's a nice Cancer time for Venus there. Yeah, but then when she goes into Leo, this is really big because what day is this? June 5th. Yeah, she will be in Leo until I believe October 8th because she's going to eventually retrograde back. So this is a really big aspect of it. And yeah, she's introduced by the opposition to Pluto.
That's poetic. That's what we think about with the Venus cycle when she goes retrograde is her rebirth and her stripping, right? The underworld, the burnt off quality of her, going through the sun conjunction. So having the whole sign kick off with an opposition to Pluto, talk about a turning point for a lot of relationships out there of all different
That's what
kinds.
That's funny. I was thinking the same thing when I was just looking at. Yeah, I think this will be a big turning because we're going to come into the Venus retrograde, but this is sort of like, I would just say this is an important time to pay attention. Interesting, when I was just referring to this time of Venus moving through Cancer for a bit, might be some kind of way to get a sense of maybe like emotional needs in relationship or just not just romantic, but even like business relationships and things that need to kind of move around or change. And right here, I think something gets introduced here that if it's not dealt with or worked through, probably becomes a big issue deal once Venus goes retrograde, right?
Absolutely.
So this will be really more than normal. This is a one to really pay attention to and like entering the sign where it's going to retrograde. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's something to just pay attention, if like what Gray was saying, with kind of that lead up and paying attention to Venusian energy, right? Because at the same time, we have Jupiter on the North Node around June 2nd. We have Mercury finally making it to the conjunction with Uranus on June 4th. And this is all Venus ruled, right? She's in Cancer ruling all this. And then she meets Pluto the day after, crossing the sign into her Leo territory, her reanimation territory, and opposes Pluto. So that's pay attention to the beginning of June and the first week of it, because there's storylines that are developing. Yeah.
I was going to say, for people that are in relationships where you are able to work on your things together, and this is actually, I think, also could be really positively like empowering
and empowering.
Empowering, I think, just because of right, she's squaring Jupiter, but Jupiter's in her sign, and so Jupiter's Venus is receiving Jupiter, and then Jupiter's in the superior square again, which just brings that like Jupiterian influence a little stronger on so there's an interesting thing where the Jupiter can kind of lift up the Venus, and Jupiter's in her sign. Plus, yeah, so I just think there's something that could be actually very empowering here. It doesn't I guess it doesn't have Venus hitting this, sure, if there's a lot of issues that have to be worked through and toxic stuff needs to come up, yeah, but it could also just be like really empowering and like, let's go do this.
Well,
let's make this happen kind of quality to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing with a relationship, especially long-term ones, is that when you have to bring up the stuff that people have been putting under the rug, or you haven't want to dealt with, or you need this now because things have to change, like those are make or break relationships moments. But the relationships that are strong, like that is the soil and the fuel that they thrive on, because and that's that Venus Jupiter to some extent. Of course it can be a little just overindulgence on a very mundane sense, but Venus and Jupiter coming together are usually, especially a square, some sort of activation and turning point and pathway for a relationship. So this first 10 days of June, and that whole period coincided with the Sagittarius full moon. So, everybody's out there. And lots of things are being said, definitely dialogue driven. It seems very active period. So, what happens next after that? Oh, basically Pluto. Yeah. Like we said, Pluto. So Mercury, and then
Pluto goes back to Capricorn. Yeah.
Yeah. And so on that same day, the 10th, 11th, basically, that's when Pluto moves back into Capricorn, Mercury into Gemini, and they trine. So that first 10, 11 days of June are pretty lit up with Plutonian action, Jupiterian, just everyone's doing something.
There's something we haven't mentioned. I'm just realizing that is going on during this whole time, is that you can see now Venus and Mars are, for people watching the video, Venus and Mars are back together in Leo. In Cancer, they also were in the same sign together. So what happened is, this will keep going as we go through, but they travel together in the same sign, and actually Venus gets a few degrees away from Mars at one point, but they never actually come together.
Yeah.
Because she ultimately stations retrograde. But there is something interesting that this whole period is going on where they're just kind of moving along together fairly close. But what keeps happening is Mars is like the leading edge, so to speak, of just like Mars will hit the well, I guess except for the case of the moon coming through, the moon's going to hit Venus before Mars, but Mars will hit like Uranus before Venus does, and that sort of thing, because it's ahead of Venus. But yeah, there's kind of moving together. They just don't ever. They don't come together. Actually,
they don't come together. That's the longer story, right? And the longer cycle of it all. And really, I think this brings us to the new moon on the 18th of June, which happens to be configured with a Saturn stationing at 7 degrees Pisces at that time, and we got a new moon squaring Neptune, and then basically the Jupiter Saturn sextile. So June 17th through like the 20th, 19th, 20th, roughly. This is another intriguing period.
Yeah, this is a big deal. I mean, that new moon, and again, it's really interesting. Again, for the Saturn Neptune story, there's interesting things where I keep noticing how it's getting kind of like pinged a little bit. Like this would be another one where like Saturn's stationed, so it's activated, and the new moon squares Neptune. But I think most important is that thing you mentioned with Jupiter's coming through to complete that opening sextile with Saturn right here. Wow, Saturn's just very intensified due to stationing. So it's like what 7 degrees and 12 minutes about. So if you have anything in that first 8 degrees, Saturn's not going to go more than 8 degrees into Pisces. So that's the part of your chart to really like look at. And interesting, since Saturn does rule the first face or decan of Pisces, Saturn stays in that first 10 degrees, the entire year. Which is a decan that it's the 8 of Cups card, and that's something we haven't mentioned yet, but in the Pamela Coleman Smith Rider-Waite deck, there's that, it's a very Saturnine image of that figure like in red, kind of with like a staff kind of walking back into the mountainous area, and there's like a watery kind of landscape. And with the sextile coming in with Jupiter's rulership here, it really speaks to that, in Saturn stationing retrograde, there might be this need to like turn within, sort through things. But it's extremely at the same time fertile and creative. I know Austin Coppock in the 36 Faces book talks about this face being like the labyrinth, and sort of how in that internal landscape we can kind of both imprison ourselves in our mind constructs and also maybe like sort through stuff and kind of liberate us from those mental constructs we can have about reality. And so being a Saturn Neptune time in Pisces and reality being warped a bit in our relationship and things really dissolving and flowing, this is an interesting time period for that, for being internal. Something we haven't mentioned is that in the Chinese zodiac, this year becomes the yin water rabbit year, which is a big change from this past year being a yang water tiger year, which is yin water rabbit's much more internal, but there's a lot of fertility. And with Saturn, stationing retrograde here going in the solstice, there might be a need to make that space to kind of go within. And but again, like we talked about before, with that waxing sextile forming between them, it could be a real integration. And then with Pluto coming back to Capricorn, that to me also kind of speaks to like going within. And there's something about that Capricorn Pluto experience that gets resurrected here, that comes back into play, that hasn't been worked out yet.
Yeah. It's hard to say because all the other planets are still kicking forward, and here Saturn's Saturn and Pluto are the ones that are going back. It does bring to mind just the Saturn Jupiter sextile, thinking about the opening sextile to the 0 degrees of Aquarius, and Aquarius being, and Jupiter having just moved over that, right, and it had a chance to kind of like seed that in. Aquarius being more of the ideal vision, right? The airy construct of what that looks like. And having all this time with that personally and collectively as a cycle. And then here we get to this opening moment, and it's form based, right? And earth and water. So it just can be, I feel like it bodes well just for the bigger story of taking whatever the vision is, and actually the form is now ensuing. In whatever capacity.
Yeah, I like that too, with a new moon squaring Neptune.
Yeah, because we already talked about how Neptune has its challenges, squares of Neptune have its challenges, but it's also very, you know, like it's very dream oriented and vision, you know, collective vision here. Not just collective with, oh, well, maybe collective with everybody, but you're collecting your own visions there
Yeah,
in that
no, definitely.
mercurial Jupiter territory. So that is pretty much how Gemini season
Yep.
ends.
I think that's good for Gemini season.
So let us move on to the Cancer solstice. And I think we'll try to go a little more concise and wrapped up
Yeah,
here.
we can. I think
Just because,
we can
but
go
we got through a
faster
pretty
through.
big
Yeah,
chunk of the year.
yeah, we can go faster through this part. Definitely Cancer, I
So
think.
we have our Cancer solstice on June 12th. And so basically the whole season, we got to keep in mind the Cancer season, the whole season that Pluto is getting closer and closer to the bending of the nodes. Because the nodes are going to change signs, at least the true node, on July 17th, right in the middle of that month. And we have Neptune stationing retrograde the same day that we have a Mercury Sun cazimi. Which is interesting to me. You know, I mean, they're not going to be configured necessarily exactly by an aspect, but the last Mercury Sun cazimi, superior cazimi, was also conjunct Neptune. So,
But I think it's trining Saturn, or pretty close, isn't it?
the let's see.
I wrote that in my notes, so I hope it's accurate.
Yes, it's pretty. Yeah, it's
It's
pretty
pretty
close to a
close. It's
trine.
pretty
Yeah, I'd say
close.
it's a
Yeah.
trine.
Yeah.
It's definitely a trine on the lead up, right? You know,
Yeah.
for both planets, which will happen July 1st there. So, we also have
And it's
Venus.
sextile Jupiter too. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is another kind of one of those form building.
Definitely, it's mediating the Saturn Jupiter sextile. Yeah.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
It is playing into that 100% and adding once again, another connective and kind of familial flavor to it. Maybe some home energy that is connected with it. But one other thing we have at this time too, right after this period on July 1st, we also have Venus, who is going to make her first square to Uranus, because that is going to be part of her retrograde journey, as Gray pointed out earlier, is going to be squares to Uranus. We also have Mars ingressing into Virgo, and the season ends with the Sun trining Neptune and opposing Pluto on the same day that Mars opposes Saturn, and Venus stations retrograde in Leo. So Cancer season kind of goes out with a little bit of a bang too. But the primary points seem to be that early July, when with the Sun Mercury cazimi lighting up that Jupiter Saturn sextile there, and then Venus getting her first square to Uranus. So once again, that kind of relational component and social component is getting a bit kicked up.
That's the thing I wanted to, yeah, besides the other thing you mentioned, that point, because like you said, even though technically Venus doesn't station retrograde until just after the Sun goes into Leo, but basically at the end of the Cancer season, she's stationing. She's not really moving. She's preparing to station. And one of the things that's so impactful about this retrograde she's going to go through is that square to Uranus. In fact, later, I think it's around August 13th, she forms the retrograde conjunction with the Sun. It's not exactly square Uranus, but it's close enough where this looks like one of those, like, kind of, I would be expecting civil unrest type of Venus retrograde periods. And this is the first aspect. So there's something important about how that's going to play out that comes in here.
Yeah, she is lit up. And will, this is that introductory, that the introductory of the rebellion of what that looks like will be coming in here. So basically we'll have our full moon in Capricorn on July 3rd, and
back to the full moon and with Pluto. We haven't had,
I know,
we're not actually getting away from that with the full moon in
not
Capricorn.
quite yet. Maybe next year.
Yeah.
But that really brings us to kind of more the end of the season, because I think
Yeah.
that's where the meat of the story is
Yeah,
here.
maybe like the 17th if you have the
Yeah,
nose
let's go.
switch.
The nodes switch around the 17th, 18th. I'll just put on the 18th, right?
Yeah, it's right
Right,
on the new
basically right
moon.
on that new moon.
Yeah, and it's square, and it's interestingly a new moon. It's the new moon that's like in between eclipse seasons, so it's squaring the nodes, and the nodes are actually switching right then. So it's definitely interesting from that point perspective.
Yeah, and it is opposing that Pluto at 29 degrees of Capricorn.
Yeah, so we get two, yeah, we get this big the Pluto activation again, like you're saying, back to that cardinal Pluto activation with Cancer and the node switching. We've already talked a little bit about Aries and this I guess I just want to talk about positively. So the positive way to think about this would be Aries bringing in this like impulse, going for it, making things happen. But with Libra being the south node, I don't, it's you know, you don't want to just be like, oh, let's just do the north node and the south node's bad. There's good things about the south node, and it's the main point is it's marking right the orbital motion of the moon. It's the moon's orbit crossing the ecliptic, so both sides are important to have in balance. And so Libra being about relationship, about teamwork, about um as we mentioned earlier, that there can be the one side of like fitting into group dynamics. There could be some issues around that. You know, where are you being too Libra, and where do you need to kind of be more asserting yourself versus like where do you need to like, hey, don't be so individualistic and need to think about the relationship or think about the group. And what's interesting is Venus and Mars stay as the rulers. They just switch places. Up until now, Venus has been ruling the North Node in Taurus, and Mars has been ruling the South Node in Scorpio. Now we switch to Mars is ruling the North Node in Aries, and Venus is ruling the South Node in Libra. If you want to bring in exaltation rulers, I guess we get a couple of new ones coming in with like the Sun and Saturn. But anyway, I don't know if there's
Yeah.
more about that you want to say than
Well, it
that, but
is.
that's
It's interesting. Just think about the switch, right?
mhm.
Like it's like the same rulers, but it's just a switch. We were moving towards Venus the whole time, and now we're going to be moving towards Mars. To some respect. I mean, it is a balance. It's always a balance, and we're going to experience either end. But there is, just to reiterate what you said earlier in the program about just the energy of Cardinal, right? Cardinal is pivot energy. It's fast. It's here one day, and then it turns around and goes somewhere else the next day. So just the nature of that quality, and especially how it's going to affect the dynamics of all relationships to some extent, will be a very big piece of this nodal axis change here.
And when we get to this is the actual Pluto square the nodes finally hitting
Yes,
Pluto being at the
exactly.
southern bending in evolutionary Jeff Green's version of evolutionary astrology. I actually like this technique that goes along with it. Just like it's people are familiar with it being the southern bending. He looks at that as being the south node is the resolute of. So there's a back and forth thing at play here with the nodes. He and his technique emphasizes the south node as being the resolution node, and the south to get the whole thing balanced. The south node is the one that needs a little bit more attention. So it's that Libra relationship piece, which can both be how are you losing yourself in relationship, but it can also be like, you need to pay attention to your relationship also, and on all those types of themes we were just talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is basically where it enters, and it's very convenient that it enters with a square to Pluto. It's like, talk about another dramatic entryway. But I think just this new moon in general will be one of the most interesting of the year, just because it's a cardinal new moon in Cancer. We got Mars opposing Saturn in its own, cycle, Mars Saturn cycle, which is a dynamic setup for a whole lunar cycle of just pushing energy and endurance and knowing your limits and what are you striving towards, within that. And then there's all the pressure of Pluto at the bendings. And so it
Yeah,
feels like a big pivot point.
Yeah, something just occurred to me. I think just that relationality of Libra as the South Node is going to be important. And it's interesting. There's been this big trend in astrology I've noticed in recent years where a lot more people are thinking about astrology from a relational perspective.
Yeah.
And being relational with the planets, forming relationships with the planets, and not just that, but a more animistic perspective in general, forming relationships with like all sorts of like other than human things and ancestors and things like that. So
I like that.
there's something about that I think really comes in with this, that relationality being an important part that needs to be there as part of how that Aries, that kind of feeding into and empowering that Aries, building, initiating pioneering quality. So it needs to take that Aries drive and protection and impulse needs to have all the relationships in mind.
Well, and this would be a good time. Well, don't stop listening here, but I do have an excellent episode with Michael J. Morris where we talk all about this inner relationship, especially in relation to the sun and the self, yourself, because we are in relation with everything, and so our self is part. We come to know ourselves through the relation of everything we encounter. So,
That sounds cool. Yeah, then that makes me think, actually we could even extend that to the inner multiplicity of all of everything within us. Yeah.
Especially as the sun is exalted in Aries. So there is that. So yeah, July 17th around this time is a big day. And of course it leads us to Venus going retrograde on the 22nd of July, literally on the last day, the last degree in the last minute of the sun in Cancer. Like the sun moves into Leo literally like 2 hours after Venus goes retrograde.
Yeah, this is big Leo energy. Venus is very close to Regulus here. So she is in the heart of the lion, stationing retrograde. And actually, we were saying before about, Venus having a hard time. I feel like this is like a year where maybe Venus had a hard time last year. And Venus here is just like, all right, let me, she's going to make a power play here.
She's gonna make a power play. I like it. She is stationing in essentially a trine to the North Node. It's not quite. It'll take a bit before they meet, but that's interesting to think of too there. So let's talk about Leo season. Let me get my Leo on July 22nd. So of course it starts off with a lot of activity. We got Venus stationing retrograde. We got Pluto at the exact bending of the nodes of this at this time. We also have Chiron stationing retrograde. If you follow Chiron, that will be some more fire activity going on. We have Mercury squaring Uranus, which is interesting just in relation to, like we said before, all the Mercury retrogrades that are configured to Uranus. So there's some peace that comes out of that. We have the sun making an opening square to Jupiter in Taurus. And then, of course, we have the Venus retrograde in sun activation, which will be square Uranus while they're making their cazimi just before a new moon in Leo. So should we just roll up to that Venus, that sun, like sun Taurus Venus activation?
Yeah, the main thing here is the typical things we associate with Venus retrograde, and in case you're not familiar with that, she gets really intensified. As she's going into this, she actually gets very bright in the sky. She's then coming in much closer to us in orbit. Her presence is really extreme, and just being in Leo, and even though people say Venus doesn't have like being in a fire sign or Peregrine or whatever. True, and I know that has meaning, but maybe it's because I'm a Venus in Aries. But I think I love Venus fire signs. There's a really interesting quality she takes on in fire signs, and Venus. We think about normally Venus retrograde. One of the things is often civil unrest and things, societal relationships needing to be purged or changed or renegotiated or whatever. That's absolutely going to happen with the square to Uranus. And then same thing in relationships, when there's stuff that's kind of not been talked about or buried or not dealt with, Venus retrograde can be times where something, really forces the issue. Again, with the square to Uranus, that would be the case. It is interesting, though, that square to Uranus is in the sign of Venus. Plus, before this retrograde is over, Venus is going to go back to also get some Jupiter connection. So I think personally, there's a lot of actually potential good that can come out of this Venus retrograde, and it could be a lot of things about what do you really want to creatively actualize about yourself? What's in the way? Changing that. Because there's that Uranus activation followed by a Jupiter activation, followed by another Uranus activation as Venus goes backwards and forwards. And the Jupiter quality adding with Uranus would also really, to me, add up the collective movements and unrest and that kind of thing happening too.
Right. Yeah. Because it's Jupiter's not going to make it to Uranus, but once again, we have a big lead up, and especially when it comes to collective movements, a lot of times we have things, we have a brewing story.
Venus is very much weaving it. The Venus retrograde is weaving it together. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, that's interesting to think about, just kind of that trade-off between August 7th with the sun squaring Jupiter, August 13th when the sun and Venus meet, and then Venus retrograding back to square Jupiter. So there's like this trade-off and this met in the middle with the Uranian component. So yeah, I feel like there's a big self-love dynamic. Yeah. And like awakening to what that is and growing into that, and yeah, like a sensual quality, especially with the Taurus part. Despite the world scale, it's like I feel like it can be like an awakening of like really feeling yourself in some way, like your embodiment, your spirit, like just the personal story and the desire energy and how desires change or desires are awakened. And what we're attracted to, and like the magnetic pull that we navigate life through, right? We're always moving towards what pulls us to some extent. So that could change a little bit or grow or develop into new form.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then I guess this August 13th is just like the heart of it. So especially if you have 20 degrees of Leo configured to something interesting. Yeah, it's a big moment. And this is that heart of the Leo retrograde where things get regenerated, and whatever's happened up to now, hopefully it's, stuff starts getting a little bit more figuring out what's been going on. And yeah, like I really like that about reanimation of self or reconnecting with yourself, actualizing yourself more creatively and with your desires and everything.
Yeah, because the sun is in its own sign, right? At least she's reanimating with a powerful, sun. There.
Definitely.
So that's essentially the Leo season. I think we can.
I think we can move on.
I kind of like about. I'm feeling that. All right, so let's go on to Virgo. August 23rd. So Virgo season, we have lots of stations happening in Virgo season. We have Mercury stationing retrograde and direct all in the same season. We have Uranus stationing retrograde. We have Venus stationing direct. We have Jupiter stationing retrograde. We have a Sun Mercury inferior Cazimi in trine Jupiter, who's stationing retrograde at the same time between the September 4th and 8th. And then, of course, we're going to have that Sun opposition to Saturn in Pisces, and Mars moving into Libra. So do you want to skip to the Sun Mercury Cazimi, or what sticks out to you most within?
Yeah, I mean, this is
all that?
like we've talked about the previous, Mercury retrograde. This is another Mercury retrograde in Earth sign that sort of like the Taurus one. It's not completing a perfect trine to Uranus, but it's within a few degrees of the trine to Uranus. It is Mercury in its exaltation. So this is interesting in terms of we're still in the Venus retrograde, but Venus is helically rising here. Venus is becoming, will already be visible at this point, but Venus is kind of hitting that 15-degree mark of defining the heliacal rise here. So we got Venus coming out into the world really strong. And
that square to Neptune, or square to Jupiter.
Squaring Jupiter, yeah.
I know.
Exactly.
She's like, I'm really strong. Look at me.
That's square to Jupiter. Yeah. So it's really empowered. And what's interesting is that there's, like all the stuff you were saying before about the Venus retrograde would be really coming out here. It's very visible. You're wanting to start taking action off, but then Mercury goes retrograde, trining Uranus. So I think that can be something very creatively innovative here. It does make me think with like Venus Venus is going to station direct not too far into it, like September 3rd, which is a few days before the Mercury inferior conjunction.
Yeah, because
there's something
Uranus is stationing at that same time too, essentially. That whole Mercury stationing.
Yeah,
Uranus
everything
stationing.
does. Yeah. There's basically a full moon in Pisces. And right around that full moon on August 30th, 2 days before it Uranus stations, a few days after it Venus stations, and then Jupiter stations. So they all
it's like a whole line of like planetary action. Venus emerges, Mercury and Uranus tuck back in. There's a lot of that.
Well, we can, and with a full moon illuminating all of this at the same time, and it's not conjunct Saturn, but it's really close to Saturn. We can just know Virgo season brings, plot twists, narrative story, something is changing here. And I would say, it's not like you have to sometimes that review and those things are people always throw out with Mercury retrogrades. It can sound a little cliched, but this would be one where, you are going to, there's so much changing here where you're going to need to keep be prepared for that Mercury retrograde to hopefully help you adjust to all this stuff that's changing, because there's definitely changes here. What you thought might have happened might not end up happening exactly like that. You kind of gotta leave room to work out whatever's going on here.
Yeah, it seems like you're going to have to use strategy and move your puzzle pieces in different places through certain developments, like you said, that you might not have anticipated.
Yeah.
But that's where you can use that discerning power of Mercury in Virgo. And especially in a very tangible space, right? Maybe you have to find a new job, or you have to move money around, or you have to organize a house, or create, there's all these variables that will, because Mercury, or just Virgo in general, Virgo season is when earthly reality shifts, it moves around. This is the most active period of when you see transition on Earth, before your eyes, it's literally happening. So Mercury is probably going to be figuring out all those pieces of the puzzle during this time, obviously. And the conjunction on September 6th in a trine to Jupiter, I feel will help you figure that out.
Yeah, and it's Jupiter stationing retrograde at the same time, interestingly. So there's something here that's very much almost like that forward movement of Jupiter is pausing. There's something about coalescing insight about everything that's been happening, and making those adjustments.
All right. I gotta change my headphone here. Gray, can you hear me?
Yeah, I
All
can.
right, I can hear you too. Okay. My
I guess
AirPods have died because we are too loquacious people.
But we're getting, at least we're turning the corner to the end of the year here.
We're turning the corner.
I mean, if we want to, speed it up a little here. I mean, there's a new moon on Virgo on September 14th, and then the next day Mercury's stationing direct. So it's a nice. I like this new moon because the new moon is it's the middle of September. It's trining Uranus. Mercury's stationing. Again, it seems like this really interesting Uranian quality comes in, which is sort of a theme for the year. I feel like Uranus keeps showing up, and I know there's some hard aspects to Uranus, but I keep sort of feeling like there's something here that we've been dealing with Uranus and Taurus for so long now. It's like, use an innovative aspect of Uranus to come in here to help with whatever's happening, because we don't have, who knows what's going to be going on collectively in world events at this point. There's all sorts of possibilities.
There are all sorts of possibilities. That is for sure.
Yeah.
But at least we're flowing with them, right? We're in the trine to Uranus. We are moving, we're doing our earth magic, right? This feels very earth magic.
This is earth magician time here.
Yeah, absolutely. So mid-September we kind of get and it's Mercury emerging, right? We're doing
Mercury's so likely rising. Yeah, it is literally the earth magician, because Mercury is like stationing, becoming visible.
Yeah,
ruling
so how do you want to move your earth around? What are your intentions? How do you need to move everything around, shake it up? So I like that about this period. Which really brings us to Libra season and our fall equinox. And so the fall equinox, we have our final Venus square to Uranus. So she'll complete that journey. We have planets that are going to start to conjunct the Libra South node at this point. And, Mars is sitting in the middle of Libra. So Mars is the first to do so, to conjunct the South node. And of course, square Pluto right after that. We also have Venus ingressing into Virgo and opposing Saturn. And we have Mars ingressing into Scorpio just before we have a solar, South node solar eclipse in Libra. So we're getting back into eclipse season, right? And then the season ends with a Sun Mercury superior Cazimi that is also square Pluto. So, is there anything I'm missing there, Gray?
That sounds great.
Does that sound great? You up for this season?
Yeah.
So that Venus Uranus story is changing.
I mean, that's
nice.
Yeah, that feels like one of the really big things at the beginning of the month. It's happening basically the same time as that full moon in Aries you mentioned.
Yeah, so pretty much the exact September 29th.
Yeah. And Mercury would be trining Jupiter here. Oh, wait. Maybe not. Maybe trining Uranus. Yeah. So Mercury has moved from the trine to Jupiter to the trine with Uranus here. And which is sort of starting to finish. So that's kind of interesting. There's a couple things finishing up here, which is the full moon's like illuminating. Mercury's done its retrograde. It's come back to finish that trine with Uranus. Venus has done its retrograde. They've come back to square Uranus the last time. So that's really interesting here. It kind of pulls us out of
what I'm thinking. I just saw kind of a piece come up because, right, we're leading to the end of this season being a South node solar eclipse in Libra, right? Which is going to be Venus ruled. And so here we see Venus leaving that square with Uranus at the same time as the Aries full moon. And this is that's always a big relational full moon, right? You're feeling into yourself and your own needs, and you're versus, the dynamics of a partnership or, so there just seems to be maybe this final Uranian notch with Venus that kind of lights up to the full moon that is going to eventually carry into the South Node solar eclipse in Libra, as far as like the state of relation on many injustice, on many levels. This seems to just sort of be like a exclamation point in time that I think leads us to that solar eclipse.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Mars is ruling the Aries moon and is basically at the solar eclipse degree at the south node.
Yeah.
What's kind of neat about this, I think this is probably, because we talk about when the Mars activates the eclipse, like maybe it's good that Mars is activating the eclipse hasn't happened yet. So Mars, but I guess what is happening is Mars will then will oppose when Mars gets to 20, right before Mars goes into Scorpio, essentially it is activating that previous Aries eclipse degree by opposing it.
It is, and squaring Pluto right before it. So
it's
we're
definitely
in hot spot Mars territory.
Yeah, we're
especially
back
relationally.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a good point about the Aries full moon.
Yeah, so just keep in mind on September 29th, there can be a lot of changing dynamics with relationships, with social stories, with justice related stories, with the Libra component, court cases, things along those lines. But yeah, she feels like, because all that retrograde period and that Uranian action, this is that leaving moment and her getting to the end of her shadow there. And of course, what's interesting is, of course, she's going to move into Virgo. And so having the solar eclipse with Venus in fall. Yeah. Yep.
But this brings us finally to the end of the Venus in Leo, which was back on sometime I can't remember the date now, when Venus first went into Leo.
It was, I forget too. We've said so much.
Yeah, but months, I think it was back in June, but I don't remember the date at the moment. Let's see.
I guess that's what I have software for.
June 5th. I thought it was June 5th. Okay.
June 5th.
Should have just said it. I was not trusting my memory. Yeah, so since June 5th. So
that's
yeah,
4 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so but you're right, then Venus is going into her fall and
opposing Saturn, like right away.
Saturn. Yeah. So
she gets pretty serious.
And then Mars is still kind of near the south node. The sun's coming near the south node. Mars is getting to activate that previous eclipse degree. Mars is square Pluto. So this there could be some rockier stuff here to be working out that's coming up. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is definitely a lead up. I feel like Venus is getting entirely realistic and she's ready.
You're right. That's a great point for, like, if you think about the larger picture of everything that gets stirred up by that Venus retrograde. Sometimes there's a delayed reaction where it's not like everything changes. And at this point, Venus in Virgo is going to probably let you know what's wrong with the picture. If
she's going to let you,
if things are not going the right way. So yeah, that would definitely be happening here.
Yeah, so we have a lead up to a solar eclipse on the south node in Libra, ruled by this Venus. She opposes Saturn. To basically mid-October, opposes Saturn. She's going to keep cruising to then trine Jupiter, right? She is moving along. So that's kind of in between that eclipse that takes place on October 14th. We have a 21-degree solar eclipse on the south node. Mars will have moved into Scorpio at that time. Venus, as we just said, is leaving her opposition with Saturn. She's basically caught between opposition with Saturn and moving towards a trine with Jupiter there. Mercury's kind of all up in the business, but combusts, like and opposing Chiron. So
Yeah, I mean, there's some tough stuff there with that, but that trine from Venus to Jupiter is nice. With Jupiter being in Venus's sign, that's at least something helpful.
Yeah.
And
And I
this would
think,
be the,
go ahead.
I was gonna say, this is just like a real proper Libra eclipse, really close to the south node of in Libra. I think it's an annular eclipse. It's one of those like looks like a ring of light eclipses where it's mostly black, but that outside ring of light.
Yeah.
And so that storyline of the Libra Aries story that's going to start going back and forth is really getting developed here, whatever that is for you with like your chart and everything. And it's also
Yeah.
squaring Pluto, so it brings in that Pluto aspect again that's been with us. You know, Pluto's been squaring the nodes the whole time, but I guess there's probably something that really comes into fruition, and whatever that underlying dynamic has been with Pluto squaring the nodes, like really comes in strong here.
Yeah. And the more as we talk about it, talk this out, that whole transition between Pluto and Aquarius and Capricorn dancing back and forth is highly activated this
Yeah.
year. So, we're getting out of Saturn, Uranus territory, but we are navigating and entering new Pluto themes and wrapping up old ones. So, it does bode well for change, but also purification. Something's not working. If something, if you need to address, it's not, it feels like this is the year not to go along with it. This is the year to like, no, I'm changing.
Right.
I am setting up this. This is no more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Mars in Scorpio at this point does give that interestingly, Mars becomes like this really extreme. We're just talking about essentially dignities of the planets. Mars just is like the planet. It's in its own sign, it's in its own bounds, it's in its own. This is like that part of where Mars is so powerful by essential dignity at the beginning of Scorpio, and none of the other planets, nothing else is
No,
in
nothing. Yeah.
there except Mercury's in Libra, which is at least an air sign. It's a triplicity ruler, but still Mars is like the. So there's something where like, yeah, maybe leaning into the Mars, like you were just saying, to
Well, it
make
is
stuff really
trine
happen.
Saturn. That's the
Yeah, it's
thing with
trining Saturn.
all these planets going into Scorpio as we get into Scorpio season is they're going to make trines to Saturn, who's getting ready to station at 0 degrees of Pisces. So that does bode well for Mars.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And does give us the willpower to make new constructs, make maybe emotionally difficult decisions that are better in the long run,
Mm-hmm.
So let us move on to Scorpio season
Great. That's what
here.
I was going to say. The same thing. Let's just go to Scorpio now.
Let's just get into Scorpio, which is literally like the day later, October. Oh no, why am I on
No,
the
it's
move?
not. But
Wrong.
it's the right. It's like a week later, but it's a good move, I think. Yeah.
There we go. October 23rd. So Scorpio season, just like Mars that I just mentioned, basically the sun, Mercury. Oh, Mercury crossed over. Well, we didn't say that. There was at the end of Libra season, there was a Mercury superior conjunction in Libra. Right before that. Just a little FYI, and then square Pluto. So there is that component, like right not too long after the eclipse takes place on October 21st. So it's an interesting lead up to Scorpio season, right? You get a Sun, Mercury, Cazimi square Pluto, and then you're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you're in the season of change and decay and transforming dynamics. So basically, Mercury, the Sun, Mars had already everyone's trining Saturn.
Yeah.
And we're on our way to penumbral eclipse, lunar eclipse in Taurus, which is going to be configured to Mars, Mercury, wait, I think my notes are weird. Well, anyways, to Mars, Mercury, and Jupiter, and then Saturn stations
Mars is
direct.
opposite Jupiter at the lunar eclipse.
Yeah.
It's in Taurus. Yeah.
And it looks like we have a lit up Martian new moon in Scorpio, because there's going to be a Sun Mars conjunction and opposition with
Yeah,
Uranus and a
that's
trine to Neptune. That's a big thing.
that's a really big deal. That Mars Kazemi, yeah.
So let's just move to the lunations because those seem to
Yeah.
be the most important here. So we have the eclipse on October 28th, the
Yep.
lunar eclipse in Taurus, and this is the final one, Gray, right? Isn't this the
This is a
final in
final,
this?
yeah, this is the final one. These fixed sign eclipses just really stretched it out because the first one was like 2 years earlier and towards the end of 2021 in Taurus. This is the final one, and I really like this one. The moon is still being eclipsed in the same sign as Uranus, but it's pretty far from Uranus, and it's actually really close to Jupiter. So Jupiter is in between the moon and Uranus, which I think is helpful. The Mars in Scorpio is opposite Jupiter, so is Mercury. It's very dynamic. But compared to the other eclipses we've had this past year, I like this. This one has more beneficial quality to it. It seems like there can maybe be some more like helpful, productive kinds of changes and things like that coming in.
Especially... Go ahead.
I was going to say the big thing, just if you want to, unless you have something else to say about this one, is just that Mars is combust at the same time as this eclipse, and so that is happening all through Scorpio's season. Is Mars is sort of in the underworld in Scorpio, but really in its element and getting to be very hidden and secretive. Sort of the perfect setup for Mars, and we then get to so there's probably really interesting behind the scenes moves happening all during this time because Mercury's also combust with Mars and Scorpio. But we get to that November 17th. Well, I guess there's a new moon, and you want to do the new moon first on November 13th. Yeah.
The November 13th. Yeah, we got a new moon that's configured pretty closely to Mars here.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is opposing Uranus pretty directly. So whatever we were conspiring behind the scenes, I feel like surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Uranus is back in the picture, right? That's we're not getting away from Uranus this year. No, it is configured to many of the lunations in one way or another. So reconfigurations, sudden changes. Well, maybe not so sudden because it's in Taurus, but there are shifting energies here. But I like what you said about the behind the scenes and just I feel like there's going to be a lot of like ninja moves taking place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then this November 17th, that's when we get to that thing you mentioned before. So what's interesting, Mars goes from opposing Uranus and then the Mars-Sun conjunction. They both are, which is also, when Uranus is like close to us as it gets, sometimes it's actually visible even. But then that Mars is superior conjunction of Mars, where Mars is regenerated, reanimated in Scorpio, happens, trining Neptune in Pisces. And the moon is actually, looks like it's in Capricorn around that time. So the moon's even in the exaltation of Mars. And in fact, I've actually looked ahead at this. I kind of like this as a chart to do. I'm going to do something Mars in your life. It's if you ever want to work with a Mars in the underworld, not visible, but being close to the conjunction, because the moon's in it's like, there's moon's in a harmonious aspect to Mars here.
It makes me think of it just makes me think of two things. The whole Mars Neptune dynamic of the retrograde, right? And the fact that the Sun Mars synodic cycle is setting up after this fact, and also that we had a lunar eclipse that was in the same position in 2021 that was trining Neptune.
That's a really good point, actually. It comes back to that eclipse degree again.
So there seems to be this there's a bigger story.
There might be so when you think about that Scorpio eclipse earlier this year, was that May 16th? I want to say.
The Scorpio eclipse. I think it was Cinco de Mayo.
Oh no, in 2022 I
Oh,
meant.
2022. Yeah, no, that was like right smack dab. Yeah, I think it was the 16th.
Yeah, and so it was a lunar eclipse basically right, or I thought that's what you're saying. I think that is something that, and there might be interesting about all the maybe chaotic changes that were happening earlier this year back in May. Next year in Scorpio, there might be something, yeah, this kind of new push development building off of that, perhaps. It's the way
Because
I'd
this is
like
a
to,
long
the way
cycle.
that I'd like to think about it. There might be still, world event disruptive things happening based on some of those events, but just personally, yeah, coming back around
And this is a start of a whole new synodic cycle with Mars much
yeah.
stronger. The last one in Libra with the sun in
Hmm.
its
That
the
was a
sun in its
tough,
fall, the
that
Mars in
was,
its detriment,
yeah,
like this is a better situation.
that was a tough one.
It was a tough one.
The other thing is Venus has been in Libra. We didn't mention Venus going to Libra on November 8th, but Venus is in Libra during this time too. So that's at least something also that's in the mix.
Which bodes well for all the activity that we saw earlier with lead up to the solar eclipse and Venus squaring Uranus, the whole like kind of relational bit.
Yeah, Venus and Libra, that should help a little bit relationally. And
And
yeah,
same with Mars and Scorpio,
Mars and
feels
Scorpio.
like
Yeah.
there's it's more solid dynamic. So that really brings us to Sagittarius
Yep.
season. And Sagittarius season starts November 22nd. Our joyous Jupiterian time of year.
Yeah. But
And
this,
although
like I say, yeah, this one has a little bit more of a harsh opening to
it's a
it.
little wet
It's like,
blankety when
yeah.
with Saturn and Pisces squaring that 0 degree Sagittarius sun there. And of course Mars. So
Yeah, I was
basically
gonna say
sun.
because I was thinking because Mars goes into Sag almost right away and squares Saturn. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So it's basically Sun square Saturn, then Mars square Saturn. And Mars is going to square Saturn actually really near the full moon in Gemini. We also have Venus making a conjunction with the South Node, and then
yeah.
squaring Pluto, and then moving into Scorpio, and then doing the trine to Saturn. That lead up. We have Neptune stationing direct, which Neptune is in a player too. Man, all these cats. We have a Sagittarius new moon with Mercury and Venus lighting up Jupiter as Mercury stations retrograde. So, we're getting to the end of the year here with that. But that sun, yeah, that beginning of Sag season with the sun squaring Saturn and then Mars 2 days after it, feels 3 days after it. Yeah, it may not be the most jovial of energies. But
Is that after thanks? Yeah, we don't need to talk about that. Never mind. It's like, we don't need to talk about Thanksgiving. I don't want to actually.
I think
I
that
think
is
it's
during smack
during
dab
it.
during Thanksgiving. So
I was gonna
expect
say, be careful who you invite to Thanksgiving. What I was gonna say on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna be cooking
Um,
you're gonna have way more work to do than you normally would.
yeah.
Yeah.
But then the full moon, and then the other thing is that the full moon comes in right there, and it's basically opposite Mars. So that's just kind of part of that opening. It's maybe a little rocky, but it's definitely active and dynamic. And let's
Just
see.
feels like we have a lot of stuff going on. That's all really to me, it's just,
Yeah.
and we got to handle a lot of things. I mean, we're not getting away from another Gemini full moon with Mars, right? Because this year we had Mars retrograde on the Gemini full moon, and now we have the opposition.
Yeah. And the other thing
Here.
is, let's see, Mercury's at 24. I don't know if Mercury's hit its shadow zone degree yet, but it's fairly close because what happens after this full moon is Mercury goes into Capricorn on December 1st, and that's where Mercury's going to go retrograde. So we actually get, if you count the fact that Mercury was retrograde at the beginning of the year, it's like the fourth. I said at the beginning, we begin the year with Mercury retrograde, we end the year with Mercury retrograde. So Mercury going into Capricorn here, I think it's probably close to its maximum elongation and is starting to slow down, because I know the inferior conjunction ends up being on the solstice around that 0 Capricorn place. And so as we're heading into that, we get that really active full moon opposite Mars, and then Mercury's starting to slow down to get ready to go retrograde as we get into this Sagittarius season. Venus goes into Scorpio, so there, and it's, you know, it makes her opposite Jupiter and will end up being opposite Uranus. So Venus will activate that thing again as we go into that.
Which makes me
Mercury
just
retrograde.
think about all the, like, I mean, it's holidays, right? It's like all the buying, Venus opposing Jupiter and Taurus, like during during, you know, the holiday season. And then here we have this new moon in Sag that's pretty much square Neptune, while Mercury's going retrograde.
Yeah.
I have a feeling there's going to be some mix-ups with you know, products and packaging and like getting things on time, and like definitely order ahead.
Yeah.
Do your Christmas shopping ahead.
You want to plan ahead for the gifts. Yeah.
Last minute might not work out too well this year.
Yeah.
Especially with the right, because Mercury goes retrograde, but right before it does, it makes a trine to Jupiter. So right, we're like buying and buying and buying, and then all of a sudden it's like, this is delayed, this is out of stock, or this got shipped somewhere, you know, like, yeah, it's that's
true. It's true. I also like it though, just for this particular retrograde. I like that it starts with that trine to Jupiter. That seems helpful, at least for maybe there's something especially sometimes I think Mercury retrograde can be great when you actually have something to work on, like a research project or something you're developing. You can kind of really, because Mercury gets so intensified, and you can really dig into it during the Mercury retrograde. And beginning with that trine to Jupiter, it seems like one of those that could be the case.
Yeah.
But it ends up being a pretty volatile Mercury retrograde, because basically if you see Mars back in Sag, they're slowly going to come together, because Mercury is going backwards, Mars is coming forward. And so by the end of it, Mars and Mercury will be kind of colliding.
Yeah.
Eventually. That's not during Sagittarius season, but that's yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting to think though, that the solstice will have the Cazimi on it, the sun Mercury Cazimi. That feels very Earth magician.
It's an Earth magician. It's an Earth magician again. Yeah.
Earth magician is back.
And moon's in Taurus with Jupiter. It's even more Earth magician. Venus opposite Uranus, trining Neptune. It is definitely the Earth magician.
And this is when you buy your gifts like really last minute on the 22nd, and then it just happens to work. You got
that is actually the miraculous. Yeah, like I don't know what I'm gonna do, and you're like
through, and you didn't think it was gonna make it, and then all of a sudden it arrives all on the same day, and you're like, yes.
Or you're just going out to stores last minute shopping, and it's just like nail it.
That's funny. But yeah, Mercury will retrograde back into Sagittarius for the end of the year. But you are right. They have basically the in-between zone from Christmas or time to the new year is laden with a Mercury retrograde on Mars. So
yeah, which could be
a little dangerous, especially with Mercury detriment and retrograde
and stuff. But one thing you could also look at that is whatever that is, this is be the version. Not at the beginning, I was thinking, I really love the solstice New Year setup this year. This is a little bit more like it does make me think, if you're making those resolutions and, whatever you figure out what you want to do in the year ahead, this time next year, that as Mars comes in with Mercury stationing, it could be just like take action on this kind of quality. And what I really like though, is that on almost the last day of the year, December 30th, December 29th, Venus goes into Sagittarius, and the very next day, Jupiter stations direct. So it's like at the end of the year, we end the year with Jupiter stationing in Taurus, and that means Jupiter's going to move ahead. It's like it's on a one track
Taurus track
to Uranus. It's heading. It's going to move straight through to Uranus in a year ahead, which will be very innovative. And I really like that Jupiter's quality of stationing at the end of the year could be great for lots of things. Yeah.
I mean, just talk about the year ahead. And you know that we always talk about, this is our New Year's resolution. This is what we want to do. But it really packs a punch this particular year. It feels like, and just for those curious, that Jupiter Uranus conjunction will be April 20th, the same day as the eclipse of last year. That special 420. 420. Yeah. So, I mean, Gray, what, let's think about this here. We have made it through, which is miraculous.
Yeah, earlier, another years we've done this, you've asked about the tarot card of the year. I don't know if you've thought of this, and I had a moment thinking earlier, what would it be? And I had one moment of thinking, I wonder if it would be the Strength card. And then actually, before we did this, I have a Leonora Carrington deck, which is all major arcana paintings she's made. And I just pulled one to see, and I got the moon, and I was like, oh, the moon, I don't know. But then as we were doing it, he kept saying
Pisces card. That's
Pisces. That's true. That's actually a good fit for the moon and working through. But as you kept bringing up, I actually now want to go with the magician. Because of that Earth magician that kept coming up through our talk.
That's the card I drew today.
Oh, okay.
For me.
All right, funny. I think that's. Well, can I see that one again?
Is that a raven?
Is that a raven? Or
I drew the Wheel of Fortune and the magician.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, that really goes with the end of the year ending with Mercury trine Jupiter.
Yeah. That's there
I like that. I like that. What deck is that?
The Brady Tarot.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent. These are all, for those watching the video, these are all woodcuts. These are all woodcuts that she did.
That's beautiful.
And it's all North American animals. It's a great deck.
Well, I really like the spider also, as far as with the Wheel of Fortune and the Jupiter ruling all the Pisces, just sort of thinking about what kind of what are you weaving with your web, what are you containing, what's interrelationally, what's kind of tugging on that, what are you kind of drawing in, and just really paying attention to that. And yeah, the magician card, I hadn't thought of that earlier, but going through the year, I actually think that's a great card, because even though there's volatile stuff, it's also a very dynamic year. And in terms of, I know with astrology, it's become increasingly popular to talk about things all about fate and things being fated, but there is the aspect of how you respond and how do you use your will. And I think this year is a really good example of that. And so I like that magician card of in terms of like dealing with all this stuff and really asserting yourself, making things happen.
Well, the magician, it's all about resourcefulness.
You
have your elements before you. How do you choose to use them? What do you intend? And are you actively engaging with it? And yeah, especially with all the Taurus resourcefulness.
Yeah, there's actually an essay by Ursula K. Le Guin that that Ignota Books, who actually have been invited me to start writing for them, and I've just kind of kept doing it. They have like these full moon journals, but they published a little volume of this essay by Ursula K. Le Guin called "The Carrier Bag of Fiction" that some people may have heard of. And when I realized she wrote it during the balsamic Saturn Neptune in like 1988, when they were like balsamic to one another last time, just like they are going to be now before the conjunction. And then I actually just came across a podcast where people are I think it's called Between the Covers, and the guy that hosts that podcast actually wrote a book with Ursula K. Le Guin, and he made this sort of like homage of podcast episodes about Ursula K. Le Guin. And I was just listening to the one about the carrier bag of fiction. And so what this essay is about is she's on one hand sort of refuting and playing with the idea of like the hero's journey and how everything's all about like the hero, or like in 2001 Space Odyssey, like the first tool is like a weapon, like he throws a bone up in the air and it cuts to like humans dominating outer space, or like being
Very Martian.
yeah, and kind of like
Solar.
this age of air quality of people, the way people are kind of projecting it's going to be. And she challenges that with like, well, the first tool is actually like a carrier bag and people gathering seeds and gathering, and there's this idea of like what you're containing and collecting, and instead of the stories having to be all about conflict is just actually one aspect of this much larger tapestry, and kind of like pulling off of this idea of just everything's about the hero and the. But one of the in one of the previous podcasts they talked about this idea that if you don't imagine if you don't imagine yourself into the world, or imagine the reshaping of the world, you will be imagined by it. And I believe that was Adrienne Marie Brown that was on the show talking about it. So it's sort of based on Ursula K. Le Guin, but that's actually very Earth magic.
Yes.
She has a series called Earthsea with a wizard. So I feel like I was kind of rambling there, but I hope that pulled it together in the end. I think that's very much about what it is, like really, how do you want to just imagine things to be? And what do you want to have happen? There's a lot of people saying there's a lot of things that could happen with world events, but and I think in addition to that, it's very much about with the South Node and Libra and some of the other things we were talking about, gathering other, being in relationship with other people, finding people that are like your allies and supports and community and that kind of thing, and developing that this year.
Yeah, no, that feels apropos for just all the form, right? We talked a lot about form, and we're not islands. We have, in order to create things around us, as I say, it takes a village. So we have to be in contact with our resources, we have to be in contact with other people, and we have to be receptive. I feel like that's a big part of this year too, is being able to be receptive and to be the receptacle and to receive and hold, to some extent too, which is like an internalized process. And it kind of goes back to just the quote that you gave too, with the idea of like holding the imagination, holding the quality of intention within, because it's easy to think about something for fleeting for a moment or kind of want that, but you have to hold on to it. You have to embody it, right? Like that's the idea of like the magician quality, is like the intention isn't fleeting. It is consistent. It is like churning, and it's like an internal process. And I don't know, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but like the idea of like
that makes perfect sense to me. Yeah.
The receptacle of that. But
the receptacle is a big deal, I feel like, for this period. And what I really like about what you were just saying about receptacle and receiving is going back to the Chinese zodiac perspective of being a yin water rabbit. Also, Pisces is some people use yin, but it's a nocturnal inward sign. We're getting the Saturn Neptune quality. And the thing that I like about yin yang is, or just any nocturnal day, is that it's intrinsic to creation. And we think about creation as all about like taking action and making something happen, but it isn't. I mean, that's part of it, but it can't. You have to be receiving. You have to be receptive. You can't have day without night, or light without darkness, or yang without yin. And so there is that, like, it is a period where we're going to also have to be spending time within, and doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. So open your receptacle. 2023 is coming. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
be careful about what you're. Yeah, and that's why I was saying that too when you were bringing that up earlier about the carrier bag. Carrier bag is a fiction, is theory, is that, what are you being, discerning? What are you gathering into your bag or your receptacle? What are those tools, and really using them, honing your skills on those, knowing what's yours to use, and maybe there's somebody else that's really good at this other thing. You team up with them or so forth.
Yeah. Know your strengths. When you were talking about like that from the magician, you're talking about the carrier bag. All he could think about was actually the fool and then the magician, right? Because the fool's carrying the bag
Yeah,
and it's setting out on its course, which is very Uranian and very kind of Aries in a sense. And
that brings in the Uranus. Yeah.
yeah, all it has is the bag, but I never really thought about what was in the bag, but maybe there's not much in the bag and it's actually carrying and collecting what the actual tools are going to be when it reaches the point of realizing, and that's the magician. It has to collect into its receptacle and what it carries in order to then be able to use it. And so it's like this first 2-step process basically of initiation to the beginning of like all things, right? Which feels very Aries Taurus and the whole kind of momentum that we were talking about in the eclipses and all that jazz.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Gray, I think we did it.
Yeah.
I think it's official. So, where can people find you? What do you got going on?
Oh, graycrawford.net, Gray Crawford.net is my website. And I did do that Saturn, Neptune and Pisces talk already that you can buy from my site. I'm going to be doing it again, actually, for WASA, the Washington State Astrology Organization, I think in February. And that's going to be, I think, me talking in person, and they're going to be virtually streaming it at the same time, which they're also going to be doing at NORWAC later in May. And I will be at that too, in case you want to go to NORWAC, which is in Seattle, last weekend of May. There's a lot of really great astrologers that will be there, and that's an in-person one you can go to, but they're also making that this interesting virtual in-person hybrid. So if you can't travel to Seattle area, you can still attend it virtually. And if that's the only way you can be there, I'd love to see people there for that. And I'll be doing other things. I'm actually thinking of doing a little course about Saturn, Neptune, and how to work with it, sort of in preparation as we lead into the Saturn entering Pisces. And if you're interested in that, just subscribe to my blog and or join my Patreon or email me. But that hasn't been totally announced or completely sure I'm going to do it, but I have some ideas about it that I've been thinking about. I just need to make sure I really have enough time to do it and everything. Yeah.
Well, wait with bated breath as I love it. All right. Well, you'll always be able to find Gray over at my website at energeticprinciples.com, where I'll post a blog post about this episode here and some of the details of 2023. I'll also post a link to Gray's talk if you want to check that out. You can also find me on social media, Energetic Principles. Although I admit I have not been active. I'm feeling the pull away from it too. Or maybe I'm just focused on other things, but you might find me there. I do like to post stories. I'm not so much on the grid these days, but I do like to post my stories. So definitely check there. What else is going on? I think that's it right now. I think that is it. And that's enough.
Yeah, that's definitely
That's it. So, all right. Well, if you liked what you heard here today, leave a comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, tell us what you think is involved in the year of 2023 or the impressions you took away from our talk here today, or leave a review. Is that what? Yeah. Wherever you listen to this podcast, if you're listening to the audio. And yeah, I think that share it with a friend. Share it with a friend who has a long attention span, who is patient and likes to listen to astrology.
Yeah, you can break this one down into a couple installments too. A few
Yeah.
installments. Yeah.
I do plan on putting little time markers on YouTube. I can't do that for the podcast, but I can do that for YouTube. So I hope you appreciate that. But Gray, always a pleasure. I'm glad 4 years in a row. Congratulations to us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on here again. It's been great.
Yeah, absolutely. You are welcome back. Well, to 2024, I'll cross my fingers. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in to us for this long period of time. We wish you the best in the new year ahead. And as always, may the stars be with you.